So why don't we get started? Welcome everyone to our first meeting of 2019. I'll call the meeting to order and ask for an approval of the agenda. I saw Pamela's and Nina's hands for approval of the agenda. Thank you. Declarations of conflict of interest.
Same as
Same.
prior meetings.
The same. Anything new? We've got all the panelists are in the room today. Okay, so the same and nothing new. Approval of the previous minutes, recognizing they are still not the kinds of minutes that we're hoping for and with the expectation that will happen following this meeting. Can I get approval for these minutes? Charles? Any comments?
Are these the ones that were annotated online?
Okay, we could table them as annotated.
And as notes rather than minutes.
Yeah.
Andrew had a minor amendment for myself and him, which was fine.
Okay, so as annotated. Any other comments beyond this? We have approval of both Mark and great. Okay, well, thank you for that. I don't have a ton of remarks other than to supplement the email that we got earlier this morning about using Slido, and just to highlight what it is we're going to try to achieve with that, and to encourage the panel members, if you haven't yet downloaded the app, or I think you can access it online, finding a way to do that. I've used this or seen this in use in conferences. I haven't seen it in a meeting like this, and so this is an experiment, and I would encourage panelist feedback afterward, or even during the break, depending on how things are going, and we can adjust as much as possible. But the goal here was recognizing that we have a limited amount of time, although thanks to everyone that we've got a longer meeting today. It's been around longer than we have in the past. We've got more time today than we've had at other meetings, but nevertheless, it's still a limited amount of time, and we want to ensure that that time is used as effectively as possible, reflecting the kinds of concerns that all the panel members have. And so what Slido provides an opportunity for is for people to post the kinds of questions they would like to see raised as part of the discussion, and then for panel members, and at the moment it is just panel members, to go ahead and vote on the questions that they would like to see raised. Christine and myself will be tracking the questions and the voting, and we'll by and large try to track the questions that are most popular, but it's not entirely a democracy. If we need to shift or something like that to ensure that there is a broader range of questions raised, try to make sure that those get raised too. But this allows for at least a temperature of the panel to get a sense of what people are most interested in. If you have not yet done so, please do so in terms of installing the app or going online. I can tell you that there are already 37 questions that are populated within the app. And so as we're seeing the presentation, take some time, and there's been a little bit of voting on it as well. Take the time to vote on what you see. Add those other questions, and as Sidewalk does its presentation on a number of different issues, once we move to questions, we'll have opportunity to give at least a couple moments pause to add further questions or to engage in some of the voting coming out of any particular issue. So I think we're starting with the koala. Chance to take a look at what some of the most popular questions are on that issue, ensure that they get raised, and go from there. And time depending, we may still be able to try to ensure that there's an opportunity to go more broadly around the room for people to raise some of those questions. So that's the goal of what we are trying to achieve there. We have we've been more generous in terms of time with the agenda than we were last time. Last time you recall, we ran out of time. This time there's a bit more of a buffer, and so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get everything that you see on the agenda through the agenda. So that's the plans for today. Let me turn it over to Christina for short management.
Thank you, Michael. So I just wanted to be able to give the panel a bit of an update as to where we have been. It's been a brief time actually in work days since our last meeting, so it has been a slightly smaller management report update. There we go. then the last one. So just with regards to the Data Trust Primer from Mars, so last meeting you'll remember that Joe Greenwood was here from Mars and talked about the initiative that we had underway. We had the workshop with the participants, and they were compiling that information into the Data Trust Primer. The draft primer has been completed and is been in circulation to those who attended the workshop as well. Members of DSAP were provided with an early access to the resource for feedback. We are anticipating releasing that primer to the public within the next week. Overall, the feedback we've received has been very positive in terms of the breadth of options that are presented therein and the ability for that primer to help contribute to some of the civic literacy kind of components that we're looking for as well, so that way people can engage more meaningfully in the conversation around what we're now referring to as civic digital trust, not just data trust, through this whole piece as well. DSAP new panelist recruitment with the holiday season, it was a little bit more modest in terms of the turnaround that we were looking for. So we've extended that into the end of January, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more in our closed session as well. The manager of digital governance position has been posted and closed. Shortlisted applicants will be notified this week for the first round of interviews to be able to begin next week and the following week, with still a hope of having someone on board in early to mid-February. Civic Labs are continuing to be planned. We have our next one scheduled for February the 13th. A save the date notice was circulated yesterday. The invitation list is broadly the folks that were part of the first Civic Lab, as well as those folks who are participants in the Data Trust workshop with Mars, and we'll be adding to that a little bit more fulsomely. The agenda should be circulated early next week to folks who have confirmed their participation. There'll be additional civic labs with regards to the broad digital governance principles. We'll be recircling back to that based on the feedback we've had in the public consultation piece, and these will be the independent digital principles that will govern Waterfront Toronto's approach to smart city developments moving forward. And then a subsequent piece on IP and shared benefits / data monetization will be the final planned one that we currently have on our books. The only other item of note was the Toronto Region Board of Trade's report that was released on January the 9th that looked at digital governance conversations with regards to smart cities, and really sought to elevate the conversations that have really been centered on Quayside to a broader Toronto region perspective, and looked at the role that the Toronto Public Library might be able to play in a civic data trust moving forward. We have scheduled meetings with the Board of Trade as well as Mars with the Toronto Public Library to see how we can continue that conversation as a next step as well. So very broadly, that has been the last 2.5 weeks, and I look forward to continuing and answering any questions that you may have.
Any questions at all? Okay, you didn't have to use Slido for those questions. Literally. Seeing none, we can continue on, and so we'll turn it over to Sidewalk. We have at least a couple of hours to go through a number of different things.
Happy New Year, everyone. While we're getting started, for those of you who may not remember me from last month, my name is Prem Ramaswamy. I am head of product at Sidewalk Labs, along with Craig Neville Manning, who's head of engineering at Sidewalk Labs, and we're here to present a little bit about the digital strategy that we're taking forward based on the feedback we heard last month. I wanted to start with a little bit of a recap on what we discussed the last time we were here on December 13th. So we started out reviewing a real use case for data collection that we had worked closely with park people as well as some other organizations around the goal of creating vibrant and well-managed public spaces through the Common Space application. as well as walk through the responsible data use assessment that we had created to show in a real-world application how we can ensure that we're being responsible about data use and collection. We presented this to the group here, got some feedback, and then the other part was we wanted to start diving into specific applications, again, focused around some quality of life goals that we were looking to improve around mobility, around reducing the congestion and creating safe streets, around reducing energy use in homes to try to create a climate positive neighborhood. And then finally, we didn't get to it. We've actually placed it in the appendix, and we'll pause and ask whether we should actually start there and then come back to the presentation today around how that would work for managing stormwater essentially more efficiently. In each of these use cases, we tried to walk through what the quality of life goal was and give a little bit of insight into our product development process that we're undertaking internally at Sidewalk Labs, where we start with what is that ultimate quality of life goal we're trying to improve? For example, in the case of mobility, it was safe streets and creating the most efficient network we can create while ensuring that safety exists on the streets. We start with that quality of life goal, and then we go towards kind of a customer discovery process, moving towards what we like to call product market fit, making sure that what we're building actually services that quality of life goal, is technically feasible, and also ensures that we are in this very early part of the process using privacy by design principles by conducting this responsible data use assessment. Now that responsible data use assessment process goes into a pilot stage, and you'll see today we'll talk about one of our pilots and prototypes that we have here today, and then we'll proceed hopefully as these products mature towards some form of launch or outlay in an area. And so we walked through that process, and then we also talked about some of the areas where technology is currently, very new but increasing, things like federated learning, zero knowledge proofs, things like this that are starting to get better that will allow us to, I personally believe that technology will essentially help us in ensuring that our privacy is safeguarded as we move forward in the product development process. So this was kind of a recap of last week. I want to actually stop here for a second. I don't know whether it makes sense. I wanted to ask the panel, do we want to kind of dive deep on the stormwater example? Do we want to go into today's content? As well as do we want to stop here and basically, because we ended up cutting short last time because of timing, and I don't know if there were a lot of leftover questions from last week that we should address before moving forward.
Well, I'd say that the stormwater, while important, doesn't really raise serious issues in terms of the kinds of things that the panel is concerned about.
I should
Others have expressed that too.
I should point out, a lot of the digital infrastructure we are building, though, is in that category to some extent. Sure. And I think it's a good example of where I think it is a valuable example is how third parties can take part in kind of the innovation and the ecosystem we're trying to set forth in this place, and why we think this moves towards this goal of also building this, city of the future, essentially, this district of the future in Toronto.
I think the main question I would have from that, I don't think we need to go through the example. So
okay.
I'm going to presume we all read it. But is how the whole system that you set up there in the diagram, sort of stormwater or wastewater systems citywide are citywide. So how would you reconcile a system that works quayside with systems that Toronto has a kind of long-standing system of waterworks that have been developed over a number of decades? How would it work with the rest of the city's systems? And the question probably could be extended to all of the network infrastructure.
Yeah, I think you could ask this question for each and every one of these solutions that we've set forth. Part of that is, in the next few months, as we started understanding in our product development process what it is that we actually want to start implementing, we have started engaging, with the City of Toronto, the different agencies inside Toronto, to better understand the very answer to that question, which is what parts need to integrate versus what parts can function separately, right? And I think, what we don't want to create is we don't want to create this island, essentially. We want to make sure that this is connected to the rest of the city in a very meaningful way. And so we don't want you to like suddenly hit a wall and then have to climb over that wall and come into Quayside. That would be terrible. And so we want there to be a connection to the rest of the city, and that is something we're very much considering today.
Can I just add that I'm not sure whether you are asking just about digital, but also or also the kind of the physical, the actual stormwater and so on, which obviously we're not as qualified to talk to. But we'll obviously, this whole district as it develops, whoever develops it will have to connect in with stormwater and sewage and so on. What I think this allows is to basically minimize the impact on those systems. So have a much lower likelihood of overwhelming them. So they will sort of interconnect, but in a way that doesn't require anything extra of that system, and in fact requires less in many ways.
I didn't know whether there were any also the question. I know you guys are using the new app. I didn't know if there were any questions on the app from last week that we should address, or we should just move
No,
on.
there's no Slido related, no questions on Slido at the moment for this, which is one reason why we might continue. But I know that there's questions from both Mark and Pam.
Yeah, so maybe one comment and one question, which is that certainly Waterfront Toronto along the entire East Bay front has been looking to innovate in stormwater management. And so there well could be separate facilities that could have different management systems on top of them. Without trying to dive into the details, I would take David Castern to comment on that, but I think it's certainly possible. And that really leads to the second question, which was in the slides. It mentioned that there were pilots being examined for Waterfront Toronto and also for the City of Toronto. And of course, the city's implementing massive new stormwater management infrastructure down the Don River, Coxwell Tunnel. It's a multi-billion-dollar project essentially to eliminate combined sewer overflow in the Don and in the harbor. So there could be also an opportunity related to that in terms of management of that new infrastructure. So are there any specific pilots you're aware of right now, or are there just conversations going on that in fact, of the sort of two opportunities I've mentioned, are there any specifics that this is going to be piloted on?
Off the top of my head, I don't know any specifics it's going to be piloted on in Toronto right now, but there are conversations that we're definitely having. Things like stormwater are not, they're not as easy as like, maybe a software network topology where you can just install it and do a pilot fairly quickly. So these would involve much more detailed conversations with city agencies and so on and so forth that are.
So there's no specific pilot, because just the slides implied there were pilots, there will be pilots.
I don't think there are, but I can follow up. Can I follow up on that?
Yeah,
I
because
can
I think it'd
follow
be
up
interesting.
on that.
I think there actually is an interesting opportunity right now for the city because of the massive investment that's being made in stormwater management.
And are you asking specifically about the stormwater pilot itself? Okay,
Yes.
so I'll follow up with our team that's working specifically on that to see where we are in that process.
Okay, great, thank you.
Pamela?
A question that I'll have about all forms of infrastructure, this one and other ones going forward, is in terms of the business case, does it work at the scale of Quayside? Do you need it to scale at Portlands, or do you need to scale at a citywide bit? That'll be a repeat question. And then in this particular one, I'm interested, this is a Waterfront Toronto question more than you, but how does a pilot like this fit into the environmental assessment process? In terms of implementation, it'll come up with other forms of infrastructure too. We don't have to answer it now, but down the road, I'd like to be briefed on that. So.
And specifically on the stormwater one, just to answer that, because we do work closely with the team that has been focused on that area, is that I don't know how it fits into the environmental assessment process, but I do know that one of the goals on this is to ensure that the stormwater that gets released is environmentally sound and safe, because that's part of our goals in this district, to make sure that the environment is taken care of also. But the process is a separate question. On your first question about each of the technologies and what type of scale they need, I was just talking to somebody earlier this morning about this, about the fact that often you try to figure out what the product is, how it's going to work, make sure you have some customer validation around it, and then go about kind of thinking about unit economics, business case, so on and so forth. I think for some of the things we presented last week, probably the best example would be the mobility network, where for the mobility network to really work, you do need some geographic scale, right, for it to actually give you the dividends that we're looking to get. On the flip side, on some of the building energy management stuff, you could see that happening on a building scale. But if you want it to actually become a climate positive district, it has to work almost at the grid scale there, right? And so it really depends on, as as most of you who have worked in technology know, like the concept of a minimum viable product. Like, how do we start with something simple as a small use case that then moves us forward and scales forward? And, you know, I think one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to show that this innovation can happen on a district level and that it works in all of these different manners so that it's repeatable and so that people do it, so we build more climate positive districts globally, hopefully, eventually.
I hear you. And I think the motivation behind the question is that I think part of the civic literacy that we need to build around this project is that when there's innovation coming forward, sometimes we need, like, we're going to have to be bold and brave, and we're going to have to do trade-offs. And, you know, I'll use the example of the climate modeling. You know, the curve looks great, but one of the questions I'd like to see is, with the data, how much can you do with ambient data? When do you need more personalized data? Like, where do key decision points come in terms of costs and benefits? And this is just part of all of us making good decisions around this project, that we need the information to understand, if we're going to do this, what happens when we do which things, because there are different levers that are going to be pressed, and also different opportunities. And sometimes we may say yes, and sometimes we may say no, but these kinds of questions will lead to more informed decision making, but also just better public understanding of what actually implementing innovation is, and what are the risks and what are the opportunities.
That's a great way to phrase it. And I think if any of you want to also, you know, send through Christina, like that example you just used around
the data and the curve.
Exactly. Like, that's a great example of that. And if there are other examples like that you see, that, you know, if we can, we will do our best. You know, we're also estimating a little bit ourselves.
Sure.
And the further you get out, better, you know, your estimations are, you know, as good as time is. But, you know, we can help try to put that together.
Thank you.
I realize you're still on slide number 1, but I think it's an important question here, because the stormwater example is a good one, because you know, part of the project, the Quayside project, is when we're innovating in cities and in infrastructure, we're innovating in the network. So it's both the digital network and the physical network, and so it's like trying to figure out how we make decisions where the example of the stormwater, where there are certain elements of it where you can innovate in Quayside alone and it can work. And then there's certain elements where it needs the entire network at scale in order to work. And so we have to, from a governance perspective, you mentioned doing that triage, which parts can we do only in Quayside, which parts need the entire network, is figuring out who makes that decision and then who governs what. So if you then extend, in order for it to work at the network level, then it needs to extend throughout the network. And is it Sidewalk who does that, or who does that, and how is that done? I think that's one of the core questions that we're kind of grappling with here, because we need the innovation to happen, but we need to understand how it might get propagated later.
Right, and just to add some more context as well, there's an effort within Sidewalk Labs to develop a model around the economics of Quayside that, you know, factors some of these things in, but lots more as well. And I think, you know, that's model still being built and improved, and so we will have some answers for that in the MIDIP, but, you know, we're not quite there yet in terms of the holistic approach. So that's one thing. Like, we're definitely trying to understand that problem as best we can, and to your point, which things require scale, which things maybe, you know, I guess there's almost 3 categories. Some things are at scale in a single building. Some things are at scale, you know, on a much larger scale than Quayside. Some things are, you know, are beneficial at Quayside, but just increasingly, you know, get better and better. And so, and there are a few things, I think, in that last category, which is, you know, you know, some of the things we'll talk about today. You know, there's a fairly large sort of fixed cost of, like, actually developing the technology, and then, you know, the actual, you know, deployment of it, you know, should hopefully actually be cheaper than the sort of business as usual. But it takes a certain scale to actually recoup the cost of the initial investment, and that I think in most of these cases it's significantly larger than something like just Quayside, for example.
Like that cute little fuzzy koala we'll talk about later.
Yeah, we might need to work a bit more on aesthetics, for example.
The other thing I'll just add a little bit to your to what you said is, I do think we should think about Quayside, though, you know, to some extent, as that ability to prove out some of these technologies, and if they are really good, they should get adopted more broadly, right? But it's an opportunity some of these technologies to prove out why they are so good to be utilized elsewhere also.
And I think just to add to that, you know, we certainly don't see Quayside as kind of a place to experiment. You know, this is going to be a place that people live and work and love, and, you know, that totally works. This is not a beta site. So it's more about probably us and hopefully investing more, sort of on average, on a unit basis in Quayside to understand, the various options, and then maybe some of those get winnowed out if and when those technologies go beyond Quayside.
Okay, one last one from Kevin, and then we'll.
I'm just wondering, how much effort are you putting into looking at what has already been done around the world? Like I can appreciate and admire the sort of the intent to try and see what works, but we should be also leveraging the things that have gone wrong or gone right in the past around the world. How much is that factoring into what you're pulling together?
You can talk to them.
Yeah, so quite a bit. In fact, two of the things we're going to be presenting today, are either existing standards or will be standards. That doesn't mean there isn't additional sort of development cost to render those standards into something that kind of works at scale and so on. So we're not actually starting from zero and say no, this has to be all reinvented from scratch. So we're definitely trying to take as much as we can, things that have worked well in other places, and then I think the places some other kinds of things that we see done in other cities, we think will just work much better if there is sort of an underlying design that supports those use cases. So the fact that, for example, it is very, very expensive to deploy some sort of device in the public realm in an existing city in terms of like mounting it, getting power to it, getting connectivity to it. There are a bunch of things that cities have tried on a very small scale and haven't necessarily really, hit it out of the park. We think we can take a similar idea, but essentially scale it up because the infrastructure supports it better. I think very little of what we're proposing is completely, nobody's ever thought of before. I think, but there are lots of cases where we're taking an idea that's been sort of tested at a very small scale. We're showing it how it can be deployed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, why don't we
Move on?
move on? If we have time at the end, perhaps we can circle back.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Oh, why don't you go?
So we're going to talk about three main topics today. This was based on the feedback last time we received when we were here, where we talked about applications, and the question was, can you talk a little bit more about the digital infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure that you're going to build? And so for those of you who are familiar with networking, there's like a 7-layer networking stack that you can think about, and so we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the networking layer, so a little bit about software-defined networks and how we achieve ubiquitous connectivity in this neighborhood. To some extent, the internet is becoming almost as important as water or electricity in these neighborhoods, and how do we make sure that people have access to the internet at high speeds in a reliable and secure way. In addition to that, we'll be talking a little bit about the hardware that allows that to exist. That includes the concept of the super passive optical networks, which is a new way of thinking about fiber networks in a cost reduction way, essentially. And then we'll also be talking a little bit about Koala, about how to greatly reduce the costs of urban innovation in the public space. One other topic that was asked for last time that we will not have time to discuss this time, so we'll leave to the next DSAP, assuming you folks don't want to talk about something else next time, was the open data standards as well as the standard interfaces. And that was another question that was asked last time about the details about how we're approaching that kind of open API layer, the open standards that we're trying to push. So we'll have more details on that in 4 weeks at the next DSAP, which is on Valentine's Day, in case you all were wondering. So we showed this initial slide on October 16th when we came to DSAP.
By the way, you didn't skip a slide, did you?
Did I skip a slide? Oh, I did skip a slide.
Okay.
Where we are today. That's right. So this is what I like to call our disclaimer slide. So we are still early in the overall product development cycle. I pointed out the fact we're still looking for that product market fit. We're still building prototypes that look like that. These are not finalized products in any way, shape, or form. We're learning still through this. We're learning from all of you through these public consultations. Secondly, throughout this process, we are making sure that we are committed to privacy by design principles. We are taking great care to have this embedded in the product development cycle, as well as to ensure that we're filling out things like the responsible data use assessments. And then finally, the ideas that we are describing here today, the plan is for all of these to be published standards in some way, shape, or form, and we will kind of, in the Q&A, go through what some of those details mean. So we presented, I don't know why I keep skipping on this. There we go. All right, there we go. On October 16th, we presented this slide, which gives you an idea of the
Sorry,
different...
just one sec. Whoever's on the line, if you can just mute. Sorry, go ahead.
So this slide gives you an idea of what the different layers are, and kind of thinking about digital layers and thinking about what a platform looks like. These are kind of the different layers of a platform. And the blue here represents things that third parties would do. The yellow represents things that Sidewalk may do. And over the course of the last 3 months, feedback from this panel as well as public consultation has resulted in us thinking a little bit differently about what we would do versus what third parties may own. Things like the Open Data Hub, ensuring that that's done by a third party. The sensors in the public realm, how Koala can enable a third party vibrant ecosystem of such sensors. These are areas where our thought process has evolved quite a bit. In addition to that, last week we presented, as I said, this top layer of applications that are focused on these quality of life goals. Today we'll go on the opposite side, again from a platform layer down to the connectivity and the physical layer of the network. And then next time we'll go over this middle layer, which is how the APIs and standards actually work in a way third parties can take part. So the purpose of this is just to walk through the journey that we're taking together, which hopefully at the end of next month, you folks feel like you've walked through kind of the digital infrastructure we're building at every layer and had kind of the opportunity to, ask questions and for us to get the feedback we need from this panel. So with that, I'm going to...
Before you do that, Mark.
Yeah, just, and I appreciate the process you're taking us through. One of the more interesting applications that I don't see up there yet, and I think it will raise many of the issues that we're all interested in, is the, I'll call it the enabling technology for radical mixed use, which is essentially environmental monitoring within the buildings, and other kinds of monitoring potentially within the buildings, traffic monitoring, et cetera. I think the radical mixed use has a tremendous potential urban benefit because it can create the kinds of maker spaces and small spaces that are rapidly being replaced across all of Toronto's main streets and industrial warehouses. They get turned into other things. But I think they obviously are going to raise all kinds of data ownership, privacy, et cetera, questions. So I'd very much like to see where your thinking is on that, assuming it's advanced to a reasonable state. If it's not in the next session, then maybe in the session after that.
Okay, that makes sense. Yep. Essentially, it's an extension of some of the things we talked about last time around sustainability.
Like in terms of those goals, I think we can talk about that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But the radical mixed use gets you to a much deeper level than the energy optimization, for example, in terms of what you're going to be monitoring and the potential intrusiveness of that. Right.
Sorry, just before you go, also, just to reiterate, whoever's on the phone, we're hearing quite a lot of feedback and rustling. If you can please put your phone on mute, that'd be appreciated. Go ahead.
So before I dive into some of the technical details, I wanted to address two issues which I think are sort of top of people's minds as well. One is that we're going to describe a lot about networking and physical infrastructure. And in these respects, we don't actually plan to build these ourselves. There are some fantastic local internet service providers and other infrastructure builders across Toronto and also specifically in the waterfront who do great work in terms of like the deployment of technology and the operation of the technologies. So we see ourselves as coming with some of these ideas around technology, some of the expertise in kind of taking some of the existing approaches to the next level, but don't necessarily plan to actually deploy and operate these things ourselves. So that's something we will discuss with all those potential local providers over time. The second thing I wanted to mention is that none of these technologies is exclusive in the sense that we're going to be talking about providing ubiquitous connectivity, but there's nothing to stop. And in fact, we hope that it's the case that other organizations, companies, and so on come along and provide their own solutions that might be complementary or competitive, et cetera, et cetera. So in no sense are these things exclusive. In no sense that these things we're doing completely on our own. And happy to talk more about that if people have questions. But I am going to dive into a little bit more about the networking stack. So as Prem said, we're thinking a lot about how to provide connectivity throughout the district, not just in people's apartments or offices, but in the public realm. And in fact, ideally have a place where, honestly, cities today, you can mostly get a signal on most places, but for a lot of the things that we want to accomplish in terms of quality of life, we think it's important to be able to have sort of guaranteed connectivity wherever. And some of the things that are in the way include the fact that fiber is relatively still expensive to deploy and also expensive to upgrade. And so, it's often the case that the technology that's used right now is maybe a little older than it needs to be. And so I'm going to talk about SuperPON, which is an approach to making the initial investment and deployment less expensive, but also make upgrading over time easier. Another issue is that when, as an apartment dweller, your ISP comes and connects you, get a router, maybe you decide you need a better Wi-Fi signal, so you install that yourself. Maybe the router needs some configuration. It turns out that many of us end up being network managers for our apartments and maybe even offices. And we're not always the best at it. Like, I think I'm generally pretty good at that, and I still have a lot of trouble. And so thinking about how that could be better managed and actually take the burden off of individuals who that's not their expertise or the way they want to be spending their time, and at the same time, actually produce a better result. So that's around software-defined networks. The other thing is that when you get a router, and I'll go a little deeper into this later, from your ISP, it generally has a built-in firewall, which essentially means that hopefully it's easy for me to connect out of my apartment, but it's hard to connect back in. And that's mostly for security reasons. That's a pretty good thing. They don't work actually that fantastically well, and furthermore, they get in my way if I ever want to connect to anything in my apartment when I'm outside my apartment. So again, some of the aspects of software-defined networks actually help on that front. So let's start with the software-defined networks. I've sort of mentioned some of the why already. It's difficult to access a device on my home if I'm away. And we sort of got used to the fact that there are workarounds to this. But for example, if I want to turn my thermostat up, if it could be thermostat at home, and I want to turn it down, I can do that from my phone. But the way that works is that the thermostat in my home keeps calling out to a cloud provider or keeps the connection out to the cloud. And then I make an adjustment that goes to the cloud and it goes around that way. There's technically no great reason for that. It's again because of this firewall situation. It would be great if I could have on my phone or on my device when I'm out and about complete access to my apartment, just as if I was there, but without anybody else having that same access, obviously. So I'll talk about how software-defined networks is there. Another challenge is, I set up a Wi-Fi router. Its default configuration is to at a certain power of transmission, and often that results in interference between my Wi-Fi router and the neighbors. And I wonder why my Wi-Fi is not that great. I can't really ever figure it out, but this is often a big reason. So I'll talk briefly about that. And then these devices that we talk about, we talk about, understanding the use of energy and heating and cooling and so on in buildings. One of the reasons why that's not done in a more sophisticated way is because it's actually pretty difficult to deploy these devices and expensive. And so, can we make it much more easy to deploy these? And honestly, just personally, I got one of these smart switches. I had a Christmas tree over the holidays, and I wanted to have it on a schedule and wanted to be able to switch it off remotely. And getting it connected to the network was disastrous. And again, maybe I have a too high opinion of my own technical ability, but it was way harder than I thought it could have been. So the suggestion that we have here is using something called software-defined networks, which you can Google and there are a whole bunch of explanation online of what that is. So it's a standard, and it is something that we haven't developed, but we think we can adapt and adopt to this. This will also, so I'll go into a bit more description about this, but it will also integrate well with Wi-Fi systems and 5G systems. So this is not kind of an either or. This is a supporting layer for all of those other wireless technologies and so on. Some of the how, just jumping briefly to security. Well, I'll actually describe the technology and maybe come back to what the impact of this is. So has anybody come across this previously, software-defined networks? Okay, a few people, great. And actually, I talked to somebody down at Waterloo who'd done a lot of work in this area. So it's in the process of becoming a more regular thing. But here's the idea. So currently, the layout of the internet, for example, in Toronto, is that Again, back to when you get your ISP installs, gives you a modem and connects you to the internet. You have a device, which is a router, has this built-in firewall, and essentially where somebody can connect to is defined by the rules built into that that box that's sitting in a closet somewhere, and that box has a set of very specific rules. It probably got set up by default by the ISP. As a consumer, I might be able to change those things, but it's relatively esoteric. In general, the way that I connect to other places depends on every router at every intermediate point throughout the internet. And the way the internet was designed, really right at the beginning, was to have each of these routers behave relatively independently. So the routers currently in the internet are pretty smart, and they're very, very independent. Even all the way up to some of the routers that handle a lot of traffic between cities. They essentially have a number of instructions and tables of routes that say, if I get a packet in that's destined for this IP address, so the IP address is 192.168, et cetera, sometimes you'll see those. Based on inspection of that string, of that number, it will figure out on its own essentially where to route those. And that's how the internet has worked, and it's worked reasonably well. But a couple of things have changed over time. First, those IP addresses are relatively scarce. And excuse me, I'm sort of preaching to the choir, I know, but so my apologies if I'm patronizing some or all of you. But the original, those 4 numbers with dots in between, essentially provide us with like 4 billion possible different addresses, which seemed a lot in the 1970s, and obviously doesn't seem so many now, especially with the proliferation of devices. So IPv6 is something that's going to create a lot more scope for different addresses, and will allow basically all of these individual devices to have their own IP address that's unique in the world. If I'm on this network, say at Waterfront Toronto, if I'm connected to the Wi-Fi network, and if each of you are, you have an address that's not really on the internet per se. It is only meaningful within this floor or this part. And so if I wanted to do something on the internet that other people could access, I wouldn't be easily able to do it because the IP addresses are only valid locally. But more than that, these routes, the places I can go, basically trip over these firewalls and what's called network address translation, which is the piece that kind of makes better use of this scarce resource of IP addresses. So that's kind of the current situation. We survive, it's fine, but we think there are a bunch of advantages to stepping forward to the software-defined network. So now let me describe that. We essentially have, instead of each of the routers being very smart and making their own decisions independently, we have each of the routers being relatively dumb and have a central coordination system actually telling each of the devices how they should route each of the communications. So the advantage of this is there's several upsides. One is that the devices get cheaper, and actually deploying this whole network is much more cheap. Also, now I can basically have my device, my phone, and my laptop, as I'm wandering around the district and hopefully outside of the district, have sort of almost like local connectivity to all of the things in my apartment. So if I leave the house and I've got a smart switch and I've got my iron plugged into my smart switch, I can easily switch that off without having to go through a cloud provider. Similarly, like with the thermostat I mentioned earlier, or if I want to, I've got a webcam that's trained on my dog at home and I want to check how they're doing, I can just connect directly. Rather, again, than going through the cloud and back, which is kind of a hack. Another piece about this is that when we have, and now I'm getting back to this first point of the how, if there's a device, one of the things that has happened a few times over the past few years is that Internet of Things devices, these sort of small, maybe it's a thermostat, maybe it's a webcam, often come set with a username and password, which is a default. It might be admin and password, or it might be something equally guessable. And because that's the case, bad actors have been able to kind of connect to these devices, actually change their firmware, so essentially change them from a webcam into something much more nefarious, and have them actually do bad things on the internet. If, for example, I have a thermostat, and normally it should be transmitting a few bytes every minute to kind of update what the temperature is and whether there has to be anything done, and suddenly it starts transmitting megabits per second of data, then this system, the software-defined network, can essentially detect that behavior, maybe based on some rules, understand that that's not normal, and under the right circumstances, actually cut that device off from the internet so that you essentially forestall this bad behavior. So that's one example around security. Another security-related aspect is that because these firewalls are not perfect, and because, for example, if you do want to connect from outside your apartment to a device inside your apartment, you might put a hole in your firewall to enable that. There are lots of insecurities with existing firewalls. And so this idea of a software-defined network actually creates these routes, essentially the devices that are allowed to communicate directly with each other in a way that's much more well-conceived and well-managed and verifiable and so on. So that's some of the upside of software-defined networks, and in general, they've started reusing data centers. They've been deployed, I think, in Austin, in Texas, on a medium scale. We think this is going to have a bunch of upsides for this place in Quayside. I'll also mention the managed Wi-Fi, which I talked about before, which was that by default Wi-Fi access points, the Wi-Fi routers essentially that you plug in your house, aren't really respecting your neighbors or other Wi-Fi access points that are maybe in the same building or in a radius. And so, if you open up a laptop or a phone in a random place, you'll see a huge long list of Wi-Fi access points that you can see. That doesn't seem ideal. That means that essentially each of those access points is interfering with each other to a certain amount. So having, again, a management around that to make sure that the right amount of power is being emitted by each device will actually create much better performance. So we've been experimenting with this on a small scale, and I guess today is the day of kind of things that look a bit janky. But this is just an Iraq experiment with deploying a software-defined network, and each of these, it's hard to see, it's impossible to see, but each of these is a Raspberry Pi, which is one of these very, very small computers, which essentially can mimic a web server or some device in an apartment. So each of those represents an apartment, and then along the top row, there are essentially switches, these internet switches, which are designed to implement software-defined networks. So this is essentially a simulation of a small apartment building running a software-defined network and making sure that actually the claims about software-defined networks bear out in terms of manageability, being able to set these paths up, being able to manage them over time. So that's essentially what we've been thinking about and working on, talking to people who've actually been deploying these networks. And we think that this approach will actually enable not just things to get better in terms of our own access to our own devices, but also make deployment of a lot of these technologies, which we believe are important to support the quality of life goals, much easier. So maybe I'll pause there for a minute. That was kind of a lot, but I'm very happy to answer questions on the software-defined networks piece of it.
Okay, so if you want to turn to your Slido. There's at least one question there. Note that you can sort it in the app both by what's most popular right now, but also by what's most recent. So if there's been new questions that have just been added, you can more easily see what those are. So I want to give the panel a minute to review. A lot of the questions, I must admit, it's difficult to know if these are precisely about this issue or about the issue that's to come on the Super Pond.
I'll err on the side of answering as soon as we can, but
yeah, I was actually going to suggest the opposite.
Okay,
they felt a bit more. They felt a bit more about the provider. But while people are looking and voting, Charles, you have one that's got several votes. So.
Okay, I like your explanation of the way that we've kind of tried to deal with not having enough network addresses, and I think what we've ended up, and not being a network expert, but we end up with these sort of Rogers networks where you've got a number of devices, and your device is slower because your neighbor's device, your access is slower perhaps because your neighbor is accessing information because they've created all these local networks in order to create more network addresses on one single one or one single IP. And so I see how this is a nice solution for that. Though the Rogers Networks and the corporation that is Rogers, that is a publicly regulated corporation. It has to, report on various, its activities, and it has a role in society that we know. With these hyper-local networks, you'd end up with a lot of very hyper-local networks that may be independently administered. And the question is, can anyone set these up? How do they get set up? What visibility do we have on them? So if we're in a certain neighborhood, there could be many of these networks that are set up, and we don't really know what devices are attached to them and how that information is being managed. So have you given any thought to how that might
Absolutely. So in a way, the situation here is not terribly different from the current situation in terms of how this is managed. So essentially some of you may have come across the term virtual private network, VPN. They're becoming relatively common, especially if you want to make yourself look like you're acting in a different country, et cetera, to watch the World Cup if it's not broadcasting locally. So this is a little bit analogous to that, where there's a physical network which is run by a Rogers or a Bell or a Beanfield or any number of different providers who are still responsible for running the whole thing. And then sort of overlaid on top of that in a virtual way, you have these, my private network, your private network, that person's private network. That's still kind of running over the physical network and all the devices, managed by the internet service provider. And so it's not that you can go ahead under this regime and sort of willy-nilly set up your own virtual private network. Of course, you could independently, just as you can today, sort of on top separately. But at least the ones I'm talking about here are actually just part of the network management. It's just a different approach. So rather than the ISP providing you with a router and telling you, you can have these addresses that just work inside your apartment, now they're saying, here is an address for each of your devices. Now they're potentially visible anywhere. So it's a different approach, but I don't think that the governance aspects and the management aspects in terms of kind of regulatory and legal frameworks are actually different. I haven't actually thought deeply about your exact question, but I'm fairly sure that that's true.
Okay, Dave, kind of follow.
What kind of independent network monitoring is going to happen to detect any threats? It shouldn't be inside the SDN. It should be for a safeguard. Some kind of independent network monitoring tool to detect. Have you did any research on that?
Not deeply. We essentially know this is possible, because of the nature of the design. We haven't actually sort of prototyped anything. I know that there's an open source, and I've forgotten the name of it. There is an effort to do exactly that. It's an open source, essentially software library that would attach itself to a software-defined network and do that kind of threat detection that you're talking about. It would have to have access to the network, but to your point, if it was wholly dependent on the network, that might mean that there was a way of kind of essentially turning it off from within the network, which doesn't sound so great. I think there's still a fair amount of work to be done on both the sort of intrusion detection and anomaly detection, and also on the resilience of this network. Because, to be honest, when I first heard about this idea a few years ago, I was kind of shocked because over time we've moved from maybe we're moving back. We moved from mainframes, very centralized equipment, to the internet, which is very decentralized. Now, in a way, we've moved back towards mainframes in the sense of the cloud, which is actually a bunch of small computers, but kind of logically looks like a mainframe out somewhere else. And this is, in fact, moving from a network management point of view from lots of independent routers that are going to kind of keep on doing their thing, sort of regardless of what the outside world says, to these dumber routers that have kind of a central management. And that always worries me a little bit, because once you say central management, you have to be very careful about how that central management is done. And for example, if there's a glitch with that central manager, you don't want to take the whole network down at once.
You created a central point of attack.
Yes, central point of attack, central point of failure. Might not even be anything malicious. It might have been a bug. It might have been a power outage, somebody tripping over a wire under the wall. And so we certainly want to make sure that there are redundant controllers, for example, so that if anything does happen, that there's a very quick failover. and that those controllers are in different places so that you don't have a power outage taking out them all. There's a bunch of work, some of which has been started in academia and again on a small scale, but there is work to do on this.
Did you have a follow?
Yeah, related to this, I mean, and it gets to some of the questions that are being posed there, but not specifically related to this software-defined networks. I mean, in many ways, I think there's some compelling reasons, I mean, rationales for the approach. I mean, having to have all of those Wi-Fi signals. I mean, in some apartments, you get like 50 or more of them. I mean, it's crazy. And having to manage your own local, stuff and all the problems. So I'm really with you with that. But what you're describing is counter to the fundamental principles under which the internet was originally designed. And I think that we need to be very careful when we move away from that, because there are all kinds of, and you were beginning to point to them already, what the risks are. And so I would say as you're increasingly centralizing the control, then you have to be very careful about the governance. And this gets to the question of, ownership, and also the accountabilities for making those decisions about the configuration and the deployment and the services, all that kind of stuff. So have you done, a systematic, cost-benefit analysis and I would say a socio-technical, impact assessment of these competing models? Because that, I think, is going to be essential for you to be able to make a strong case for moving, in some ways, a radical, in some ways, terribly, very advantageous, but also in some ways, turning off my iron at home, is not a compelling case for. I don't even have an iron, but I think you need to be able to much more carefully justify this kind of approach and lay out the trade-offs that we are getting into if we take this approach.
Yeah.
So one question I would ask for you is, we were chatting earlier about your background and what you worked on. Do you have like a framework that you would suggest by which that we could go through such
I just
a
have
process?
one in my back pocket. No,
when you said like, it's like a socio-technic frame, I was wondering if
Yes.
there's a framework that you would approach that with, which is something that I think we would be interested in receiving and doing ourselves.
Well, in a broader sense, I mean, the idea of socio-technical impact assessment has been around from the 1970s. There's lots of methodologies about that, but not in this particular area, not in the area of smart city development. However, there is important work being done in Canada and elsewhere that is developing those kinds of models. And I would point you to the Open North. It's based in Montreal, and also their Open Smart City Guide, which has worked this out. And then, by coincidence, yesterday, Tracy Loriot, who's a faculty member in Ottawa, made a presentation at the University of Toronto on sort of laying out a sort of schemas for how to think about the socio-technical issues and the trade-offs, and she's got quite an elaborated view of that. She's been working on it for quite a number of years, and I posted her slide presentation from yesterday. I missed it. I don't know if some of you made it, to our shared repository, and I'd be glad to share it with you. But that's where I think there's good thinking there, and there's also some work in Quebec also that provides that. Not specifically related to software-defined networks, but more broadly, thinking about this digital infrastructure that underlays a smart city development.
Right. The second thing I just wanted to mention there was, I want to stress the point that this doesn't prevent you from still running a router in your place. So this doesn't prevent any of that from still happening, which I think goes back to your initial point that it doesn't break or do anything against what essentially the structure of the internet is. Now, mind you, we do believe this is better.
Sure.
And we want it to be better. And we want people to use it because it's better, because it's safer, more reliable, easier to use, all of those things, right? And that kind of is the onus of technology to do over evolution, over time.
there's slippery slopes with immediate convenience that can lead you into very different ways than what you might take if you actually thought about it systematically. I'm not saying that this is necessarily wrong, but I think we need to step back and look at that more systematically.
We'll do.
Then.
Okay. I see one more question that's got at least a couple of supports from Charles on this specific issue. And then I think we'll move on to the super pond.
Yeah, I think there's one actually much higher even than Charles's, maybe it's mine, which relates to.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Just so happens.
Just so happens, yeah.
Convenient.
Okay. Oh, I read that as a network one. That was why.
Well, yeah, it's probably more relevant to this than the super pond.
Yeah.
But Charles, go
Okay,
ahead.
how about Charles? Go ahead since I started there, and I'll come back and make sure you get your question.
Thank you, sir.
I think it's your comment around the again, it's sort of like debating around the hyperlocal networks, but in the centralization aspect of it. It harkens back to debates we were having 25 years ago around, is the internet a public good? Do we consider it like water and air? And who provides it and who controls it and who governs it? So if we end up with I think where we landed on was that a decentralized network is difficult to govern publicly, and that it tends to be a mixture of delivered both by the private sector, but also community organizations also deliver it. We may end up in the same place with the smart cities as well, but I think we just need to be prudent around when these kinds of new technologies bring in something like a centralizing factor around who gets what network and who controls what network. That's where we have to look at who controls it, who governs, who decides, and who delivers. And it could be there's a mixture in each one of those. But I think it's part of when we're talking about the technology, all the features are great, but we also need to add in that layer of what we're going to do, especially if we're going to scale it up.
Yep.
Right. Yeah, and for example, it even just a Quayside, if you have two different providers, which seems like a great idea, or two or more providers, you need to make sure that they obviously interoperate seamlessly, so it doesn't matter, just as it doesn't in the internet, who's providing the network from the device you're trying to communicate with, and that has to be seamless. And it could be a public provider and a private provider, and to your point about kind of who provides and for whom. Organizations like Beanfield, who Waterfront Toronto have been working with, have explicitly provided affordable access to the internet, and so there's kind of a making sure those kinds of guarantees remain in place.
Okay. Mark, go ahead.
Mine's maybe a little more naive question than these, which is, there's a lot of talk about internet and data here, but at a mundane level, people are still consuming television channels, home phones, and it's not clear to me at all how, and home security systems, it's not clear to me at all how that plays within this kind of a network.
I mean, increasingly, this is going to be the initial answer I think is somewhat unhelpful, but increasingly all of those things are being delivered over the internet.
Right. Got that part as well, but
but we haven't got to 100% yet, which is the unhelpful.
If you actually want to watch in Toronto the first episode of the new season of Star Trek, it's only on Space TV on your cable channel.
Right.
So that's kind of where we are.
Yeah.
Very important.
So,
Like water, electricity, and your Star Trek episode.
that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
But I just
They similarly
lots of
restricted
people
it
buying
in
lots
the
of TV
US.
channels.
Yeah, right. So it might be the case that, increasingly it is already the case that even though you feel like you're watching TV, actually a lot of it's going over the internet in some way that's somewhat invisible to you. And we'll talk about optical networks in a second, but there's a standard for basically putting what looks like a radio frequency cable style signal over an optical fiber in a way that's kind of transparent to all the other traffic there. So I think increasingly that's going to be less and less of a distinction. But in the near term, and perhaps Quayside is already in the near term, regardless, because it's regulated, it needs to be provided. Those services need to be provided appropriately.
Yeah, and I get that, and I mean in Toronto, Bell is deploying fiber widely. Rogers is following. I mean, so I mean, I have fiber into my home that essentially all that stuff's driving by internet. But in terms of how the home is conceptualized, it needs to be able to support that set of delivery.
Yeah. I think that's probably a discussion with all of those existing providers who already have the expertise in trying to make that a seamless experience, and maybe seeing how much, if they have ideas around pushing that to like it's 100% over sort of internet protocol, invisible, but it's provided as if
it just may need some innovation that may or may not yet be there in terms of software-defined networks, which have come out of a corporate world, which is data focused. So I'm just urging you to think about the consumer world as you're heading down this path as well. And maybe one quick editorial comment, which is I've been through enough cycles of centralization, decentralization, centralization, decentralization. I've had far too long a career in my life, so I mean. That's how things go.
Right.
So if the next wave is some centralization, I'm sure 20 years from now we'll be looking at a level of decentralization happening. So I wouldn't panic over the fact that we're centralizing.
That's a good point.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's go where Toronto has not gone before. And,
No, they are.
Sorry, and talk about super.
I try to make it so.
They may not
So
That's gonna be super fun.
super passive optical networks, which is kind of a dorky name. It's not our name. I apologize. But this is one of these cases where there is a new technology that's seems like in every way is better than the old technology, and we suggest that we should stretch to deploy this new technology in Quayside. And as with all most technology advances, it's essentially you get sort of more for less in the sense that we can use the same number of fibers. So this is all around optical fiber. The same number of fibers or a smaller number of fibers to deliver connectivity to a greater number of people. Basically by, and I'll go through this a bit more in detail, but by using different wavelengths of light, different lasers on the same, transmit in parallel down the same fiber, which is not the actual differentiation between colors and frequencies. It's not in itself revolutionary, but the way it's applied in this case is. The other aspect of this, though, in addition to just additional capacity by being smarter about how information is transmitted optically, is the idea that this network is even more passive than before. Passive sounds potentially like a bad thing. In this case, it's a good thing. Passive in the context of fiber optics is essentially whenever you have a junction or whenever your signal gets a little weak or you need to split the signal to go to different buildings or different apartments, do you need something that's a complicated electrical device that's plugged into the wall, that's very expensive, that needs to be upgraded every time the kind of signal is changed? Or can you put an optical, essentially think of a prism. If you wanted to split up a beam of light into two beams of light, you use a prism. So there are essentially more sophisticated versions of that bit of glass that do a lot of the splitting and the choosing of wavelengths and so on in such a way that in a year and 5 years and 10 years, if the system that's being used to transmit light down the fiber changes, nothing needs to change in the middle. So it just makes the whole system much, much easier to upgrade. So passive is that it's going through a piece of fancy glass versus it's going through some complicated piece of digital technology that needs to be upgraded. So that's kind of passive versus active. I think I covered a lot of sort of the what there, but I'll go into explain it in a little bit more detail. The how, I mentioned this is not our idea. This is actually a proposal that came originally out of Google Fiber. And so we've been talking to Cedric Lamb, who actually co-wrote, some of you I think have seen the white paper that Jeff Tower from our team co-wrote with Cedric Lamb, basically suggesting how an idea that they've had that they're aiming to make an IEEE, that's the Electrical Engineering Standards Organization, IEEE standard, and actually something to deploy in Quayside. I just want to make clear that even though the idea came from Google Fiber, A, it's in the public realm, it's a public standard, and B, it doesn't mean that Google Fiber is deploying it, right? I just want to be very clear that that connection is not there. So it's something that any provider, here in Toronto could take that's publicly documented and basically, do here. And I think I mentioned almost all of that. Again, we just to reiterate the point I made earlier, we're not planning on deploying this ourselves, necessarily operating ourselves, but rather we're suggesting here are some ideas. We will help develop them, get them to the point where they're practical for Quayside, but leave it to others to actually implement. So the basic idea, as I kind of mentioned before, is there are various ways that that signals are transmitted down fiber optics. Fiber optics, as I think you all know, a kind of technology that was developed many decades ago at Bell Labs that, rather than using electrical impulses, uses very, very short pulses of light down an optical fiber, and it's what's used for any kind of long distance, high bandwidth communication, including especially undersea cables across oceans and so on. But now, when we talk about fiber to the home, it's essentially being deployed like all the way through to like a consumer device. So coming right into every person's apartment, a little strand of glass fiber. The idea of SuperPON is, rather than having essentially a central office where the signal originates from, and having a piece of fiber running dedicatedly from that central office all the way through to an individual apartment, or in some cases through to up to 32 apartments, you would run, say, a single fiber to an entire building or several buildings, and have basically this passive optical device, which is like a prism, but more like a kind of a diffraction grating, that would actually say this is simplifying slightly, because it's not going to be just simply blue and green. It's going to be some specific wavelength of light, but splitting off this to go to that building, this to go to that building, and then the single fiber goes to here, and that can actually go to all the apartments, and they pull off their particular piece of the signal. So what's going on with traditional gigabit passive optical networks, which are kind of the current standard, is it's using time division multiplexing, which is essentially each apartment gets a tiny fraction of a second to transmit, but those fractions are so tiny that nobody really notices that they're sharing that fiber with a bunch of other people. But again, that maxes out at about 32 different clients. So if we're sort of overlaying that with this idea of different colors down the same fiber, so you've essentially got a whole bunch of these things happening in parallel. So we're going from essentially a fiber for 32 people or 32 apartments to a fiber for about 768 different apartments. So there's that's that kind of increase in capacity with either the same amount of deployed fiber or with actually less. And then, as I mentioned, the idea that having all these passive elements throughout that kind of are basically using the physics of light, not depending on the particular decisions about exactly how the information is encoded, means that when in a few years there's better technology, and it can actually be upgraded just at what we call the head end, at the origination of the signal transmission, and at the consumer end, at the apartment or the office. So there does have to be an upgrade at each end, because of course the people in the apartment or the office are also transmitting back in the other direction, so they need to update their equipment. But it doesn't have to be done at all the places in between. Often, those devices are expensive, and they're in places that are really hard to access. So it's sort of an impediment to basically upgrading the network as a whole. So that's very briefly SuperPON. There's that white paper that I know we got to you slightly later, so apologies for that. But there's also a lot of public information about this. And as I mentioned, this is working its way through the standards committees now, so that it becomes a public standard that anybody can pick up and use. I wanted to also mention some maybe slightly more pedestrian considerations. When we were thinking initially about, okay, if you're building a new neighborhood from scratch, a place like Quayside, and there's all kinds of possibilities in terms of the infrastructure and the technology and so on, what are the things that would enable the maximum flexibility? And I'll spend a second on that, just because I think one thread that runs through a lot of the things that we've been thinking about is around flexibility, in the sense that we have a number of ideas that we're proposing, which we think are good ideas. I don't think we're going to be right on 100% of them. Some of them we'll have to refine over time as we start to develop these much more detailed plans. But nevertheless, regardless, in 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 years, there are going to be new approaches. And so whatever you build in terms of buildings and road infrastructure and so on, that's very, very difficult to change. You should make sure it's as flexible as possible, because it's really hard to know what's coming next. So I think it's interesting to look back 60, 70 years to the middle of the 20th century and see that it seemed like an amazing opportunity that everybody would have their own, was increasingly having their own car. That created a lot of freedom. Therefore, we should really design cities around freeways and cars and very wide roads and privileged cars over pedestrians. And maybe looking back, that wasn't like an ideal choice. We can sort of debate that. But it seemed like a fantastic thing at the time because this, not brand new technology, but this technology that was suddenly becoming democratized was going to transform the way people lived and worked, enable people to work over here and live here in leafy suburbs and so on. These are all ideas that seemed very reasonable and good at the time, and we have to always be cognizant that some of the ideas that seem good and great at the moment might turn out to be less good in the future. So we don't want to design too specifically to the very, very specific ideas that we have now that we think are good. Sorry, that was a little bit of a philosophical digression. But going back to this, as we did a lot of research around this, it seemed like the most important things were to make sure that every building had holes in the basement, in a way that obviously was protected from water and so on, that would allow fibers or copper or whatever crazy new technology is ahead of us to pass through in an easy way that connects to all the infrastructure under the street, but that also connects through the building and rises. And a riser is essentially just a tube that runs through all the floors, where you can basically take a wire up to a particular floor, a wire or a fiber or the moral equivalent, bring it out to an apartment and so on. And those should be they should be a certain size at least. So say 2 inches gives you a lot of kind of leeway for the future. That seems like honestly a little bit disappointing from a technological point of view, that the answer to these questions is kind of holes of a sufficient size. But we think that's roughly right, that you don't want to get too smart when you're talking about pieces of these buildings that are going to last a long time. And so there are a set of recommendations that we are making. We sort of summarize them here. There's a company called WiredScore, which is starting to produce a lot of recommendations. It's been doing some work in Toronto. We think those recommendations seem very reasonable. And so as these buildings are built out, we want to make sure that there's basically the physical appurtenances to make it easy to deploy whatever things we sort of don't anticipate yet. That was a lot about a very simple idea.
Okay. All right, so we've got, again, if you want to take a moment to put in some questions or vote on the questions that we already have there. There's one from Andrew that's got a lot of positive response, and actually it's echoed in a number of the other questions that are there on ownership of network infrastructure. So Andrew, why don't you just go ahead and pose it?
Okay, well, this is a big question, and just to comment on what you've just said, I think you're absolutely right about planning for possible futures, and it comes down to the size of the conduit, which is maybe disappointing, but I think is fundamental, and so good on that. But we also need to be thinking about not just the technical structures, but and to repeat again, governance structures. Who owns this, who controls it, and in particular, from the point of view of the public interest and what we can anticipate about that. And looking back historically, I would say that, and we've talked about it, you've mentioned it before, these are becoming utilities. You mentioned water and electricity as something that is essential to everyday life. You need it as part of any kind of full participation in contemporary living, right? Wherever you are, pretty much. And those are utilities. And this is still obviously a controversial view, but I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the collective ownership through a democratic process of fundamental infrastructure, because it can be so widely used for a whole range of purposes, and it's essential that it meet basic criteria such as affordability, universality, reliability. Those things are built into, for instance, the Telecommunications Act and explicitly. And there's been a move in the last few decades to privatize public infrastructure. And, obviously it's a mixed experiment, but I'd say Toronto has a particular view on that because it used to own, through Toronto Hydro Telecom, Toronto Hydro, which still is publicly owned and still provides our hydro, but they sold off 10 years ago, I'd say shamefully, in a very short-sighted view, that incredible asset that could be used. And there were plans at that time to provide, basic, cheap internet access to everybody in Toronto. Right? So who owns this and who controls this? And what are the plans? You had a slide on ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that this infrastructure needs to be owned by the municipality, by the city, so that it has a governance role over it and is accountable publicly to how that service works. Now, that's not a perfect solution, but what are your plans for this? I mean, can you make this, or are you planning to make this, see this as municipal infrastructure in that way, as a utility, as something that we all depend on and that we can, through our democratic means, have oversight to? Or is it going to be Google's or Sidewalks or whose?
Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I think, and Lisa, I don't know if you have thoughts on sort of from a regulatory and ownership point of view on the network. Feel free to jump in if you have opinions, but
because this
I think that's something we need to determine with a lot of consultation. I think to your point, a lot of consultation and again in collaboration with. I've already said that we don't have expertise in building these things out and operating these networks. Beyond that, it's not clear exactly what the right structure. I don't know if Mark, you were going to jump in. Or...
Mark and I have an argument about this, so I don't know.
No, we don't yet have an argument. we might have an argument.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to suggest that this is not actually for Sidewalk to decide.
No, I agree it's not for Sidewalk to decide. It definitely not is for Sidewalk.
So,
but I want to know what they're planning. Are they thinking about this?
I think they've told you that they're going to work with existing providers. They don't intend to run this service themselves. Yeah. So then it becomes a decision for the collective we, much broader than this group, as to whether in fact at this point in time Toronto wants to re-enter the the network infrastructure space or not. I think pushing Sidewalk to answer that question is probably not the right place to go.
Well, yeah, okay.
But
not least because I'm not sure I have the expertise to answer.
Well, I don't actually know that it's your place to answer it. How's that? In the same way that I think the data trust at this point you put forward as sort of ideas, and I think other folks are now going to have to evolve in terms of what is that right thing to do. With the data trust. I mean, we are in an environment where we've got regulated utilities of various kinds. If there's any telecommunications services going to be provided, I would assume that the Canadian regulatory framework applies. Where Beanfield's regulated, Rogers is regulated, as you pointed out, Bell is regulated. And in fact, Toronto Hydro is regulated by the Ontario Energy Board, and that has caused lots of interesting problems over the years. As they underinvest in infrastructure because they're not allowed to spend the money. So public regulation isn't necessarily a panacea either. Sure. So whether in fact the City of Toronto is interested in re-entering that or not is an interesting question. I mean, a political and policy question that I think is much broader than we should be pushing on these folks' shoulders. And I'm not answering the question one way or another, Andrew. No. But I'm just saying there's a different forum where I think that question should be answered.
Maybe interesting debates around municipal ownership of these infrastructure. I just for my own sake, because I wasn't myself, but I wasn't totally clear. There is already Beanfield that I understand operates a lot of operates waterfront Toronto activities. Is your vision that you're going to say this is how we do it, and hey, Beanfield, show up and do it this way, or
well,
I'm trying to understand how this interfaces with existing networks that run on the
Yeah. So I don't think we have a place to be able to mandate this in any sense. I think we're proposing this as a we believe that these technologies are going to be useful and advantageous, etc. And we would hope to work with a partner who sort of agrees and is interested in kind of working with these ideas and undoubtedly kind of modifying them and tweaking them in various ways. But this is really a question of what we think best supports, again, going all the way back to sort of quality of life goals, what supports those, and let's figure out again with partners the best way to make these things happen, and to deeply evaluate them. So if we get sort of into a much deeper evaluation, and some of these some horrendous unseen problem arises along the lines that you raised, Andrew, we have to go to Plan B. I don't think that's completely unanticipated.
Maybe unless somebody else wants to jump in, I'll try and clarify my question, because maybe I didn't say it clearly enough. I'm not asking Sidewalk to decide this. Mark is absolutely right. It's not your job and so on. What I guess I'm asking about is, what are Alphabet's ambitions in terms of the Quayside project in relation to this infrastructure? Google Fiber has 19 Google Fiber cities in the U.S. In some of them, they own fiber, and they are offering that as services. In others, it's just in residential, apartment buildings and things like that. The SuperPON description, technically, it's amazing. I think from a technical point of view, it's beautiful. It has a 50-kilometer radius in terms of reach. That is a large city-wide scope, and it's not inconsistent with the ambitions of Google and an Alphabet in order to provide an entire network infrastructure for a whole city. You've tried that in the United States. Is this Google Alphabet's bridgehead into Canada in terms?
No.
Yeah, right. So
short answer, no.
Well, I say that
there's been no discussion of that. There's no plan for that.
So that's the short, easy answer there.
But I think if we have to evaluate the, and I'm going to merge. As a sort of a unified body, Google, Alphabet, and Sidewalk Labs in this case. And
But
I know there's some objection.
To be clear, no, I don't think we should though in this case.
Okay.
I think we should separate them because we are a separate entity.
Well, from the outside, you don't look that way. I understand, Prem, you had to quit your job at Google.
I do. I understand it.
Yes, you paid a price. You left Silicon Valley, and you're out in New York, and you're regretting the sunshine, and so on. Right. So
It's
from
much
your point of
colder
view,
in New
I
York.
can quite understand that you feel you're in a different organization. But from an outside point of view, you are, wholly owned by Alphabet, which is led by, the founders of Google. When Sephram was here in the August meeting, asked, what does Alphabet want? And I was told that Mountain View is paying very close attention. I think we have to look at this project within a wider, let's say a political economic lens, in terms of a wider strategic view of where is Google Alphabet going. And it is not short on ambition. And I think we need to judge the proposals here in light of those prospective possibilities. We have to do an analysis that takes that into account. And you've talked about long-term prospective analysis needed from a technical point of view, and absolutely right. We have to do a similar kind of analysis in a long-term, in a political economic sense. And just as
Andrew, I appreciate the point.
Yeah.
That wasn't what I saw on Slido. But nevertheless, I'll give you guys an opportunity to respond. But with respect, there are quite a number of panelists that have actually raised substantive questions coming out of this particular presentation, and I do want to make sure within the time frame that we get a chance to deal with that, rather than questions about corporate structure and some of the questions you posed.
But all right, I did a lot of work. As you might have seen, in terms of preparing to try to be able to do this kind of analysis of its technical systems in a broader frame. And I think being too narrow about our analysis is to our detriment. So I hope there will be other opportunities to be able to return to these broader questions. So I'm happy to obviously give the floor to not take the hog at all myself, but I will come back to this.
I don't know if you want to respond at all.
We'll move on.
Okay. Yuda had a question that kind of bridges both the the earlier question on software-defined networks in this.
Yeah, so much of the conversation has presented this dichotomy of the private and the public. When you are digitally excluded, quite often a means to get access to some of the new digital features is through collectives of various sorts, co-ops, community groups, etc. How have you accounted for that more collective structure within this, within your presentation, which often presents this dichotomy of private-public?
Yeah, I think, we haven't really addressed, although briefly, with relation to your question earlier, the question of multiple providers, and where providers might be a co-op. Is that part of your question, where essentially service might be provided by
customers, the users would not in fact be private individuals. There would, and this gets into ownership, it gets into affordability, it gets into a number of different issues, but it often requires a different structure in terms of how things are deployed, how things are sold, how things are offered.
Yeah, I think at the level that we're discussing it here, I don't think there's anything that precludes different structures in terms of the way service is provided. In fact, this might support better a group of people who want to collaborate in a way that is kind of again one of these essentially private networks. That's a sort of technical point. I don't think we should probably do some more thinking about the lines, the questions you're asking, but I'm not sure we have anything that particularly addresses. I don't think, like I said, I don't think it precludes. I don't think we have anything particular to say from a technical point of view about that.
There's a whole line of work that we do have though around diversity and inclusion and affordability, and I think it will get partially addressed through that. I'm not sure if that's your question.
No,
I might not be understanding the question properly.
Yeah, often the inclusion and the diversity and things are sort of tagged onto a structure or a way of classifying the functions that are there. As opposed to thinking of the entire structure in such a way that there is a sense that it's not just, this dichotomy of public-private, thinking that the customers are either private or they're public. In order to afford greater inclusion, often there needs to be collective and community, which is neither public nor private.
Mm-hmm.
And the business models that are available don't take that into account. The affordability doesn't take that into account. And so I'm asking.
I got it. Yeah. No, that's actually a great piece of feedback. We'll take that into account, and I don't think we have an answer right now for you, but it is a good piece of feedback that we'll consider. Part of this was also because a lot of this stuff is about technologies right now, less so about kind of the charge sheet for those technologies at this time. But
although we are aware that sometimes technologies have implications for societal and other governance questions that are maybe not obvious at first blush. So I think it's worth looking at this all through that lens. But maybe it might be good also to follow up, with you specifically.
And if you have specific examples of those collectives too in other realms, that'll be really helpful for us.
Definitely.
If you could share that through Christina, we'd love to get some of those because I think that's super helpful for us to read over and understand better.
Thanks for that. Kevin, you wanted to raise something on wireless.
This is going to be fairly easy compared to what you've been up against here. So,
softball's welcome.
It sounds like a trap to me.
I know. I guarantee it.
You're no good at poker either.
Wired networks are extremely expensive infrastructure to deploy and manage and everything like that. And we've got emerging wireless standards like 5G that are coming out that are promising to do things that we've never been able to do with wireless before. Is there a chance that all of this talk about wired networks to the buildings and everything is going to become redundant and replaced by a better wireless standard?
I think that answer is easy in the negative, in the sense that 5G actually requires, to get that sort of high throughput and high performance, requires many more access points where each access point has a smaller radius. And so the 5G is both high bandwidth but also low latency. Essentially, the time it takes for a sort of signal that I transmit from my phone, all the way through and back and so on is as small as possible. And so you actually, in that case, in the 5G case, really want fiber all the way to the actual device that's on the street, transmitting and receiving. So weirdly enough, and I think this is a little counterintuitive, 5G actually requires more wired infrastructure in order to provide that higher performance wireless infrastructure. So I think actually things are heading in the other direction.
The last mile, I would think.
Yeah,
I think it's true to the antenna.
Yeah, I think the actual antennas, or at least the radio. Yeah, the radio actually needs essentially a fiber connection because they need multi-gigabit per second connections.
So the second part of the question, though,
But
which
you might know
is-
more about this than we do, so it's possible that we're wrong about that.
That's
but
why I'm asking the
yeah,
question.
yeah.
So there's a second follow on to that question, which is why are you talking about Wi-Fi when 5G is coming out, which could be another question that one could ask. And I think the answer to that one is, we're in kind of wait and see mode as 5G rollouts happen also, and as to how the chipsets roll out and how quickly they're adopted and so on and so forth. But if we get to a point where 5G indoor and outdoor is just how the world moves, that's awesome. That's great. We'll move along with it because there's no point in using a 5-year-old network, at that point.
So I think we've used Wi-Fi a lot, but we're not saying it has to be Wi-Fi. Essentially, it could be actually.
We're actually trying to be better about calling it connectivity and not specifying.
Okay, because the reason I ask is because the one thing that we don't talk a lot about when we talk about everything that this project is really the sustainability part of it, right? And let's face it, wireless infrastructure is far more cost-effective to deploy and manage than wired ones. So, but I hear that you're not stuck necessarily with what we've got here. This is the state of the art. This is what you're experimenting with now. But if 6G comes along and that wipes all this out, then there's nothing precluding us from adopting that as part of the solution going forward.
This is also part of what we talked about earlier with the size of the conduit. Sometimes your limiting factor is literally the size of your conduit, which prevents you from adding more or things like that later when you need it, which then comes back to your sustainability issue. So, to some extent, you could call this over-provisioning, but I think in this case, especially with the super PON and stuff like that, but that over-provisioning allows you to kind of be future-proof because, famously quoting Bill Gates early on where he said no one will need more than 8 kilobytes of RAM on a computer or something, right?
64.
So 64, yeah,
One
whatever
page,
it was.
basically.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark had a quick follow-up, and then we'll move on to the koala.
Just following on Kevin's question, I'm in. So I separate the question of software-defined network from the underlying radio. So presumably you could implement your software-defined network on top of 5G as opposed to Wi-Fi.
Or the other way around.
Or the other way around.
I think of my mental model at least is you've got some essentially backbone, which was mostly fiber with super PON, with network layer being SDN, and then you've essentially got 5G antennas, radios and antennas. By the way, they might not be in the same place. It's a separate story. But radios and antennas that are communicating using that backbone over as routed by software-defined networking.
Okay.
But fundamentally compatible is this.
Whether it's over or under, you could use Wi-Fi or 5G to implement.
Yes,
software-defined network.
absolutely, correct. Right, that's right. And I guess our assumption is it will be both, and they're in different parts of the spectrum, and there's new spectrum opening up, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. All right, so we're gonna move forward. This is the part where literally we may literally do a dance for you to prove out technology. So Craig is gonna switch over the input right now.
It's a good start to a demo.
Always a good start to a demo.
All right.
Oh, right. So while Craig is doing this, we we sent out the information on our koala mounts. We talked about it last time, and there was an ask that we come and we potentially demo it. So, we're praying to the demo gods that this demo actually works. I said a 70% chance of success, to which the response was 70%. That's quite high. But the idea of the koala mount right now is something that we actually discovered as a need as we were trying to understand, if we want to build out the mobility system of the future, you kind of have to understand what's happening on a curb, and how do you understand what's happening kind of at an intersection or at a curb, in a privacy-sensitive way. So we had all of these different privacy sensitive sensors that we wanted to set up and just understand, could we do something with this? And what we quickly found was the cost of installing a sensor in the real world is quite high. It's between $10,000 and $30,000 essentially. And that cost is because you need to get a bucket truck. And so you need to get a bucket truck, which is one of those cute little trucks with the person stands inside and goes up in an elevated arm lift.
Did we have slides on this?
We did. I think you switched over too quickly. And so you get these bucket trucks, and these bucket trucks essentially, you end up opening the. I think I went too far. Are you moving at the same time? So this is what the bucket trucks look like in Toronto. This is university, so you get an idea of a bucket truck right here. What you notice from this is you've closed off traffic, blocked a sidewalk. You're causing congestion, which is causing environmental kind of carbon release. You are costing the city as well as yourself a lot of money to be able to do something like this, and it's extremely disruptive, and that's for one thing that you want to install. And so what happens is cities tend to procure it, and by the way, we have more examples of this. This is what it looks like in the ground. I don't know if you know which wire here is electricity versus, the internet. I didn't know. And they're not very well labeled. They are very colorful and beautiful sometimes, but not very well labeled. And what's interesting is we actually had a team travel to Japan. This is Panasonic City of the Future. They still have bucket trucks. They're smaller, they're cuter, they're blue, but they're still bucket trucks. And so what we found is this is a real kind of problem, and the cost of it, what that's resulted in, is that there's the urban tech innovation in this space has kind of slowed down because of the capital cost required. And on the flip side, the procurement cycle is one where you want to procure something where once you put it up there, as a fact it's going to work for at least 5 years, if not longer. Which usually means the technology has been tried out for at least 5 years. So by the time you're installing it, you're 2 technology cycles behind, and by the time its end of life is approaching, you're about 4 technology cycles behind on the actual device, sensor, light, antenna, whatever it is you might be putting up there. The cost of those also increase massively because of this. So if you think about the cost of a antenna that you're putting up versus a router in your home, which is essentially the same technology, but one of them has to last for so much longer because of the cost of having to take it down later. It's just not worth it. So one of our thoughts along here was in the area of digital infrastructure, can we unlock a new ecosystem of innovation by making it much cheaper to be able to mount technology in the public realm in this way? Now, to be able to mount technology, it's not just the fact of fixing it up there. It's also the fact of getting it power, and in some way, shape, or form, getting it connectivity. So with those 3 concepts in mind, we thought about the idea of building out this device, and we called it a koala, because, they attach to one another and they're fuzzy and cute. And we thought about 3 specific use cases for this. One is around lights. The second one around 5G antennas, which need a lot more spaces in the city because, they have much smaller radius of performance, as well as for items potentially like sensors. And so with that, I think what might make sense to do, so these are 3 other things Koala can potentially provide, right? So one is security. So because it's a physical device that latches on, there's some physical device authentication that can happen that potentially could give power to, our proposed civic data trust to say if this device is allowed to function in the public realm, right? So this was approved, and here's your key to be allowed to actually place it up there and use it. In addition to that, you can imagine as a standardized ecosystem, if we consider this to sort of be the USB port for the urban city, that this starts creating a whole new ecosystem of devices and use cases that Sidewalk Labs, the City of Toronto, has not thought of yet even. And that can really create a burgeoning ecosystem here to solve problems in the future.
And just to expand on that slightly, because I keep using this dorky USB analogy, but we on our computers and on our phones and so on, we all have USB connectors. But thinking about the computer, essentially allows you to plug a keyboard in, or a webcam, or charge your phone, or connect a digital camera and download photos. A whole bunch of things you can do because it provides a standardized physical specification, which means that any USB device can plug into that port. It provides connectivity. It has some serial lines, to transfer data, and then it also has power at 5 volts. And because it's standardized, there are all these, it's kind of it's such an obvious thing to do if you're making a new device to make it USB compatible, and suddenly you have access to sort of every computer manufactured in the last 20, 30 years. That just doesn't exist right now when we think about urban technology. And that's one of the reasons why we don't think that that technology environment is actually as vibrant as it could be. So if we could get to a point where this was a kind of a standardized thing, again, promulgated as an open standard that anybody could use, that might give rise to a whole bunch of technology and devices and ideas that people just haven't thought of because it has been too cost prohibitive to even consider providing something that works in an urban environment outside. So that's sort of the hope that we open up this a lot more, combined with the fact that Prem said that if you make it easier to sort of upgrade over time or swap out, again, that makes it much easier to think about new kinds of technology that maybe don't have to be proven for a decade or last for a decade.
Now, it's important to state here, this is the usual disclaimer side that devices aren't required to use this mount. We don't imagine this to be a requirement for any device, but we do think this will be superior. It will reduce costs. It will hopefully be better than what exists today, and it will be published as a standard. And to succeed, this requires an ecosystem of devices. So this has to sort of needs that standards body sort of approach to make this a successful thing. We need to find, I like to joke, we're still looking for the light bulb, as light bulb was for electricity in terms of that killer use case for this. And we think 5G antennas potentially are it. And we're talking, we're in active discussions with folks to figure out what that initial use case is for something like this. What we wanted to do quickly was show you a demo of the actual device that we built to date. And so what you see here on this mount is this thing right here is a radar sensor by Velodyne. So what is it radar or LiDAR? It's LiDAR. So this is a LiDAR sensor by Velodyne. So it's shooting out like little lasers at everyone and counting the returns back to create a 3-dimensional display of the space. And this is a nice kind of display because you can't actually tell the difference between Craig and myself through the sensor, but you can kind of see us dancing around.
And our heads are cut off. But I think if I did this, would my head be on? Yes, my head would be on.
And you really see him be a shadow more than head itself. And for those of you at the table, you might actually be able to wave your arms. You can see some of the chairs, a chair here, a chair there, and you may be able to see yourselves in it. But as you can see, it doesn't necessarily identify any individual itself. So this is an example of technology that is non-personal data, that doesn't collect anything about individuals in any way, shape, or form. Now, Sorry? Oh, yeah, right.
I mean, actually, I'm half serious with that. Like, it is mostly kind of, it's somewhat privacy preserving, right? Because it's very hard to identify from people from there. But you can imagine if you had a very particular profile that you might be identified. So I don't think we want to make too strong a claim about LiDAR as kind of by default completely non-personalized, but it's better than a camera. So anyway, we're not actually here to pitch LiDARs, but by the way, it is one of the sensors we're thinking about. The problem with LiDARs right now is not so much privacy or technology, it's the cost. This thing was $6,000 or $8,000? $8,000 for just the little puck thing here. It's kind of outrageous. We think that'll come down over time, but it's not at the right point yet.
So I'm going to ask Craig. This is the part where everyone has to say ooh and ah on time. So Craig's going to remove the sensor, and what you'll notice is he's just going to press a little spring clip on the back, and it's just going to come right off. Right, so.
By the way, Tom built this. Just FYI, we had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, Tom Kennedy is a hardware engineer with us who built this. And then Craig is going to pick up a light.
And just before that, let's point out that this is what would be on the pole, and hopefully mostly embedded in the pole, so it wouldn't be kind of sticking out, except for these sort of ears. And also, by the way, this is almost certainly not the final design. This is our current thoughts about the right way to do this. These ears are built to basically. Look at this quickly again. Basically, to be something where I can slot this in a bunch of. I could be somewhat rough with this, or approximate because this might be high up. I might be using a pole to attach this. Maybe even in the future a drone. You want to make sure that you don't have to be completely on. This should sort of sit into place and then lock in. But you can imagine these in the longer run actually being manufactured as part of the pole. The other thing that's going on here is that this panel here is inductive power and inductive data. So in order for this to be hermetically sealed, so sort of to keep dust and water and so on out, there's no actual contact here. Although we do have a version with a contact, we're still trying to figure out what the right solution is. But with that demo, the data coming off the LiDAR was being transmitted through here with a millimeter wave radio signal. So it has to be, a few millimeters away from each other, so they have to be like this. But they're transmitting at a gigabit and a half. Could be a lot higher as well than a gigabit and a half. And it was also providing power through here in the same way that if you have a phone with an inductive charger, with a non-wired charger, that's inductive power at a much lower wattage. This is over 100. Is it actually 200? It's 150. So this is transmitting up to 150 watts. And just to give you a sense, this is an LED light that could be a little lighter, probably. But if I just drop that on, so that just automatically starts working. It's quite bright. Could be even brighter. I forget, what did we decide this was consuming in terms of watts? 40 or 50 watts. So this is a third of the power you would get at I'll take it off. And then, and I didn't have to do anything special to get that to start up. Unfortunately, the current state of technology for LiDAR communications means that probably when I put this back on, it's not going to automatically start up. But, miracles
that's
do
just
happen.
on the software side.
Yeah, exactly.
But
So basically, the software reconnecting to that takes a second. Although,
Just thinking about it.
yeah.
But your email's perfect.
But yeah.
Anyway, keep talking,
So
Graham.
this gives you a general idea of what we think is a fundamental piece of digital infrastructure. Now again, these are simply mounts. This is not logic. These are not the brains behind the mounts. These are not the governance issues behind the mounts. We think that for the governance issues, we think one of the bodies that we've set up around the Civic Data Trust, this actually gives the Civic Data Trust more control, both from an actual who gets to mount perspective, but also potentially gives auditing control. So an example of this is, let's say one of the devices on this was a pedestrian counter. And then suddenly you see that pedestrian counter is producing gigabytes of data per day. It's probably not a pedestrian counter or malfunctioning in some way, shape, or form. And so it gives some ability to understand what the data profile of these things should look like and see whether they are, there we are again. And see whether
Hopefully that would be a little more
outside.
automatic than Tom unplugging things and that.
But this gives you a general idea of some of this underlying digital infrastructure that we think can really kind of leapfrog and help, not only Toronto, but this ecosystem in Toronto around technology to grow, with these sorts of sensors that isn't an area of technology that's really there right now because of the startup costs associated with it. So I think that is sort of the end of our presentation, if I'm correct. Yeah, so we have a nice little summary slide about all of this, about how essentially what we presented today about the hardware. Again, the quality of life goals we're going after is the ability to make it easier, safer, and more reliable to connect, as well as to get that burgeoning ecosystem up and running faster. And so these technologies kind of help you along that way. I wanted to pause at this point because I know I think there are a lot of questions about Koala, and we're happy to field them.
Yeah, there are a bunch. And so I'd encourage the panel to add some additional ones, and if they have any, and vote on what we have right now. Let me go to a couple that were kind of in the queue before. There's a couple that have just entered in. There is one, I think this came from Andrew. I think Christina's one who posted it, about providing an inventory of possible and planned sensor types, prospective benefits and costs. So in other words, more information associated with the sensor network side of that.
So again, the sensor network side of it ties directly to the use cases, which ties directly to the quality of life goals we're trying to implement. So that was last month's presentation around.
And by the way, just nomenclature. There's no sort of set. There's a network, and there are some sensors that might. But there's no sort of sensor network specifically. I'm being pedantic, but just in case that's confusing.
Correct.
Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
But if you're, Bram, if you want to continue.
That was the answer. That the goal here again is to provide a device that reduces the cost of doing things. So last week, for example, we talked about a mobility management system. In the mobility management system, we deep dived into the specific example of curb management, But in the slide deck, we also had the example of what the type of sensors in an intersection may look like to be able to help with the mobility management system. And those are the types of sensors we're thinking about. We actually brought one of them today, which is a LiDAR sensor itself.
Yeah. And I think it's worth sort of recapping what those potentially are. So that really at the moment we're focusing on the use case itself, which is for curb management. Is there a vehicle on a pit part of the curb, or more generally, which pieces of the curb are available right now for sort of intersection optimization and sort of reduction of congestion? What is the flow of vehicles, of pedestrians, of bikes, property scooters, who knows what, through the intersection, so that we can maybe optimize that flow rather than the straightforward traffic light, do something more sophisticated. And so both of those sensors are likely to be something either like a LiDAR, but it would have to be a lot cheaper. Maybe a camera with computer vision built in, so that none of the actual footage leaves the device, but rather it's just counts of people, rough counts of people, or volumes, speeds, and so on. Or radar is getting increasingly interesting. That sounds kind of weird, but now there are very, very small radar detectors. They're very, very cheap. They're a few cents compared to this thing, which is $8,000, but they're much lower resolution than that. So we sort of saw the point cloud. That actually might be a good thing. It might be that that resolution is enough to do what the mobility system needs, but also is much more privacy preserving by default. So radars are interesting. So we're actually going to start to do some more evaluation of essentially that technology. And again, we don't think we're going to have to develop this technology ourselves. We think there are technology providers, including companies like Maya Vision, but there are others that are working with computer vision and so on. So that's one category of things in the public realm, and it's probably the major one. Obviously, there'll also be things like so that's not except that's not a sensor. There's a bunch of uses that are not sensors, and then I think the other things are just around sort of weather and air quality. What's the temperature, what's the humidity, and what's the wind speed? Maybe what are the possibly noise. Again, noise, you have to be careful, right, from a privacy point of view. You want to measure sort of general decibels, but not anything more specific than that. And then, specific, PM10, PM2.5, the particulate matter, which those sensors are somewhat more tricky to actually have readings that are reasonable over time. That technology probably needs to get better. And obviously, we know the temperature in Toronto right now, but we think it's useful to actually know if Koala is successful and you can actually deploy what are fundamentally pretty cheap sensors, also in a cheap way, knowing the wind speed on every corner, knowing the temperature on every corner, will actually tell us much more about comfort in the city in ways that we probably don't know enough about right now, because we just have these measurements on a much coarser level. I can't think of other sensors in the public realm that are kind of deriving from our use cases right now that sort of are currently planned.
Okay, so if I can then just elaborate. I mean, I think this looks like a very cool kit. I mean, it's very clever, and also I can see lots of positive use cases. But if I stand back and think, what does this afford generally, and what will other people want to do, and thinking about it not just in the case of Quayside, but as Curtis said last time, once you've got this, it's going to be around the world, and it's going to be used in all kinds of other things. So when I look at this, I think great sensors, are great sensing possibilities, but also it's enabling a plug-and-play surveillance, total surveillance network for urban spaces, right? So I worry about that. And you mentioned cameras.
Can I answer that question first? So I do think to some extent that's where, the ordering of these presentations starting at the Civic Data Trust, I think was not a mistake on our part. I think the goal of a Civic Data Trust, or the proposal that we had for the Civic Data Trust, is to give that governance structure on top of this to ensure that, that dystopian future does not come to exist.
Okay, I think that's important, and I agree that is an essential item. I guess 2 points. If you go back a slide or two, it's the one that's no, not that one. It had the list of it said it was non-personal data. Oh, it's missing Maybe you took out a slide because it's in the previous deck.
No, this is the slide.
This is the one we sent to Christina.
Okay, I'll show. Well, anyway, the point is you mentioned collection of only non-personal data. How do you guarantee that on this? It seems that you can't. So then, what I suggest, if it's going to be used widely, and this is a provocative proposal, that it carry licensing terms that are comparable to what the data trust, so that when it's deployed elsewhere, it has to meet those requirements. I call it
like contractual terms. I think that's a great suggestion.
The equivalent
Something
of
we'll definitely take
of a
into
general
account.
public license, I call it a civic public license, about what are the terms in which you can use this, and it needs to respect transparency, accountability, and the other kinds
Yeah,
of things.
no, I think that's a great suggestion.
Okay, well that at least eases my mind, because I don't want to support something that is going to be used in that way. Because you look around, what are the things that are mounted on site outside of buildings? They're surveillance cameras, and we know squat about them. And they're not compliant with Canadian law even. And we've done studies of this, extensive studies.
No, look, same page on this one. I think that's something that we'll definitely take into account. It's great feedback.
Okay, there's several. I feel like I'm watching an Instagram account here. We've got several. We've got several questions where there's support. There is a lot of support for when are we taking a break.
Excellent.
We're almost there.
And our agenda was for 3:20. We have a little bit of flexibility, but we'll make for sure it's a hard stop by 3:30 for sure. So we'll take a break at that time, if not a little bit before. Pamela had a couple of questions, teaser and questions.
One of them is, so it seems to me that this is something in between a utility pole and the array of things. Like there are, like it's a piece of infrastructure, but with it comes some stuff that you can do. It's becoming increasingly common on open data portals to inventory where these things are. The array of things has a whole series of public engagement programming around it. If those are kind of two bookends, if this was to go forward, how much do you imagine sharing locations, but also, blog posts about who's attaching their things?
Sure.
So, well, one of the things we're going to talk about it next time, which is there's a half yellow, half blue line called the high resolution map, which one of Craig's proposals that he thinks we should do along with the civic data trust.
You can tell that Prem doesn't totally agree, but carry on.
Just giving him credit. One of Craig's proposals along with the civic data trust, whether we do it or whether the civic data trust does it on their own, is that every time you file an RDUA for one of these devices to go up on one of these
and
maps,
again, so that's
the responsible data use assessment. Once you file one of those, the idea is that puts a pinpoint on a map saying this is the thing that's happening here.
And by the way, it might
it's
even
supposed to be.
Right.
Which, by the way, to your point, Andrew, is an opportunity where, there are contractual agreements potentially as part of that civic data trust that says this is what I agree to do, right? And if you break those contractual agreements, there could be consequences for breaking those contractual agreements.
Right. Is Koala the pole too, or just the mount on the pole?
We're just thinking it's the mount on the pole, but it could be built in at manufacture. Eventually, if it's successful, it could be part of the manufacturer.
So would it be users would basically have an easement to use the pole?
So I think you're getting to the second set of questions, which is around business model. We're still very early on this part, right? So there is, as I said, going back to the product development process, make sure there's a product, there's a customer, there's a need, there's all of that stuff. And then we get to what are the different business models? We've thought about some potential ones here. They range from you sell these to the city for X dollars, and the city installs them and figures it out, right? There's another model where, for example, we install them in cities and then we sublease the space to devices that want to go up, right? Yeah. There are many hybrid models in between those also.
But also, there's questions about that as well, because we mentioned earlier Toronto Hydro. Toronto Hydro owns and manages a lot of the poles. So there's a bunch of complicated questions about who actually has rights to do what.
And not just the pole. Then there's questions about the power and the connectivity too. So this is pretty complex here. What we're trying to do right now is show a need, find a use case for that need that's super compelling, prove it works, and then try to find the right partners to prove out that it will actually that it is that it has kind of legs as a product.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, just I think mine was on innovation and risk, and I always think in the space of innovation, it's always to mitigate a risk or it creates a risk. And I think we have to constantly be asking that question, and there's healthy tension with that. And to me, it was just interesting to understand when you're talking about a social good in terms of potentially whatever construct business model we have, this is a universal mount theoretically that we could scale in the future and use and devices much like the USB. I love that analogy, by the way. I don't think it's boring. I think it's great. But also, if you looked at the bucket trucks, and I thought that was really interesting. It just got me thinking about. Well, it's pretty risky, actually. You've got a human going in a machine in all weathers, blocking traffic with other humans underneath. Not just like an inconvenience, but there's a risk factor. And have you started to think about doing this study on the alleviation of risk to human, to humanity in many ways? And I think it would be an interesting outcome because as a potential innovation, it could mitigate risks that are well known around the world and well documented in terms of
that's great feedback. We should. I think we've discussed it. We haven't actually sat there with a spreadsheet and figured out what it is, but I think that's a great suggestion that we do.
Yeah, it's not just the cost, right?
Yeah, no, you're right.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Kevin.
Yeah, so it's the engineer and me coming out again.
Love it.
The Zigbee Alliance has been doing a lot of work more around industrial. I think they're starting to do more around smart cities, IoT connectivity. Is there anything that's coming out of there that you would see as comparable? I don't think they get into the physical side of things yet.
Yeah, so Zigbee is great at low. It's designed for low bit rates. So I'm not sure that, and low bit rates and kind of tens of feet kind of thing. So I think we might well actually. I'm right. Actually, you could have a Zigbee. I'm just thinking aloud. You could have you could either mount a Zigbee transponder on one of these, or you could build a Zigbee transponder in, and then it would be easy to deploy Zigbee devices around. Actually, Tom's probably thought through this more. I don't know if
it could definitely act as a gateway to the rest of a smaller Zigbee network or mesh networking point. Gateway back to IP.
Yeah, so I see it could be compatible, but I'm just wondering if the Zigbee Alliance is already working on the kinds of things around the smart cities context already that may turn into a standard.
And we've talked to, I'm going to get the name of the acronym wrong, MRI Networks. There's a three-letter, MMR, I think, which is a MMB, thank you. Okay, we got there. Which is a Toronto-based company, which is actually a leader in a lot of the, if you buy, sorry, just to slide aside, so Zigbee is a protocol for, if you have a smart light switch off, that's turning the lights on and off that doesn't have wires in the back of it. It's probably a Zigbee light switch that's communicating turn light 53 on, turn light 53 off, which is a very small amount of information. So it's done with a battery-powered transmitter and receiver, etc. So it's a really interesting protocol for these kinds of applications, for kind of smart infrastructure applications. So they've done a lot of work in this and actually provide a lot of the infrastructure. And so they are interested in kind of collaborating in some way. So you could imagine, either building them in so it was trivial to deploy a Zigbee device. And actually, the other thing that reminds me of is something called LoRaWAN, which is a long-range, low-power, very low bandwidth network that's not tens of feet, several, a bunch of meters, but is actually kilometers. Having that kind of network in this district would also be helpful, again, to drive down the cost of a device that doesn't need high bandwidth connectivity, but could be battery powered and could be deployed even easier than putting something on here.
Okay. I have Charles, Dave, and Mark.
Okay. I like this idea a lot. I think with the rise of smart cities, this has sort of been a missing piece. This kind of, I like the USB analogy. I guess I have a two-part question. One is around, you have a trademark on it, and you've sort of talked to it already. Like, I think it's more the name probably, but so understanding kind of that business model.
We had a brief discussion last night. Elisa's the head of legal, and I'm like, do we have to have the TM on? She's like,
yeah.
I
figure it's the name.
It is a name that we want to use.
Yeah. We thought it was really cute. And we want to use the name for this purpose. So.
But as Prem said, we think in order to be successful, it has to be a standard. USB has a particular structure around the consortium of a set of companies who implement USB, and they make some contribution to sort of maintain the standard and provide certification and so on. So we suspect that something like that would be necessary in this case. But to the extent that Sidewalk Labs can make money off this, it won't be sort of at the exclusion of others. It will be because maybe we make the best one or whatever.
Right. And so I would suggest that once we get to the point of looking at it, where we are with the plan, the overall plan, is one element is that what's the model for that? What's the license? Is there licensing? Like what would Waterfront Toronto have to do? But the second piece is more from the design piece. It's like it reminds me of I'm on the board of Jane's Walk, which are urban walks inspired by Jane Jacobs. And we had a walk a couple of years ago, which was digital infrastructure in the city that's often unseen and unknown. And the entire walk was pointing out there's all the cell phone towers in the neighborhood. There's the data warehouse. There's the data area, the data farm. And there's not a lot. There is, in some cases, like cell phone towers, a lot of sort of governance and regulation around it, also a lot of controversy. And in other areas like surveillance cameras, not so much, right? And so
there is a Jane's Walk on surveillance cameras.
Yeah, yes. So I think that I'm wondering whether there's two elements of this as part of the MIDP, which is the design element of how are these seen and experienced when you're walking through the neighborhoods? What do they look like? How obvious are they? How not obvious are they? And how do they incorporate into the built environment? But also the digital layer experience design of that, which is going back to your map where we know where they are, we know what's on them, and that's publicly available. So people can see where the sensors are.
And by the way, even more than a map, just to nerd out for a second more, probably a bunch of you have tried augmented reality where you essentially hold up a phone or something similar and look around. The idea would be that this map wouldn't just be points on a flat plane. It would be like, look around, oh, I see there's a camera there. I hadn't noticed that camera before, but it's registered by, with the data trust and therefore is available for me to kind of look around and almost X-ray vision to like how am I being.
And I would also point out that like we are, actively looking at it, thinking about like how do you message, what exists in a public space in a way that people realize it better. And we're doing some active design sprints in this space. We hope something comes out of it. There have been a lot of projects and work in this space already, but we think there's something to add about the urban space to this.
And actually, on that point, we look at things like nutrition labels on on food, and wondering whether there's a simple kind of symbology or standard format that is actually, in addition to kind of a clever app, an actual thing that you can look at and say, oh, I see that device was placed there by this organization for this purpose, and allows me to link back to the actual RDUA or similar that was filed with the data trust for that thing.
I think it's really important because that it provides that transparency, the development of set of standards around it, understanding okay, I know that that's looking at me for this purpose, but also now we're going to see that more and more globally. This is an opportunity for us to actually start to develop some of those.
I agree, and like we hope this raises that awareness too, right? Like that this is kind of the social license you have around the civic data trust to allow these things, is that people understand what exists out there, what is being used for what purpose, and that the purposes drive again these underlying use cases that people want.
Agreed. I think like the reason I thought of the Jane's Walk was a number of the people on the walk were like, they didn't even see any of this infrastructure. It's in plain sight in many cases, but still
we do
unseen.
it with you once? Because like we're actually both saying that would be very interesting for us. I'm being honest. Like it would be great to go about and do that with our team at some point.
Okay, cool. Talk more.
Okay, we've just done a poll, and if you're open to it, we'd love to continue with some questions after the break. And so actually with that, if you're good with that in mind, we're actually at 3:20. We've got a couple questions in the queue, so why don't we actually take a break then, and then we'll come back and have those questions we started with. Good to reconvene. We've got a couple of questions, not a lot, but if there are others who want to chime in, we can devote a couple of minutes and then move on with the agenda. And I'll start with Mark, actually.
Oh, great, thanks. So I was glad to hear you talk about how the USB standard is managed, in fact, by an industry consortium. And if you want some entertainment, you could look at who the original players were. At least a couple of them are still in business. Good point.
But the standard lives on.
The standard lives on. The standard lives on, and so that leads me to a question of how do we create the support systems for the standards to live on. And so it isn't just about this. You've got a whole other set of areas where standards can be evolved, and there's seems to be a natural push to, well, let's make the digital trust, take care of these standards, and I'm a little anxious about that. Because I think the digital trust is more, in my mind, more locally focused on responsible data use in Toronto, in Quayside, and everything that's associated with that. And maybe that model's replicable elsewhere, but I don't view data trust as being some global enterprise. I think it has to respond to local values and local needs.
Completely agree.
Yeah, it leads me to think a bit about, there was, I think, part of some of your original proposal, response to the RFP, some discussion of an innovation institute that was academically focused perhaps. And I'm wondering if you might consider whether that in fact could house some form of standards organization that in fact could as a mission look to propagate those kinds of things globally. So that's just a thought for you.
I think that's something worth considering. I think also for some of these things where like SuperPond, where IEEE exists as a standards body that does this successfully, there are places where we'll likely go to that have done these things successfully to learn from them. But I think that's a good option.
Well, and propose certain things as IEEE standards, for example.
I'm not excluding that possibility. I'm just, in this area of urban data standards, certainly, I mean, there's a paucity of locations where that exists.
Right.
And so that, along with maybe, this might be an IEEE standard, I don't know, or it might be elsewhere, but I think that's an opportunity that we should try and take advantage of to give it a mission. So, thought for it.
Pamela?
I'm good.
Right. Well, you got a very popular question then, Elena. On who gets to decide what gets attached.
So who gets to decide? I thought I could have asked that before.
I think you answered it.
Yeah, okay.
I can answer it again. So I think who gets to decide what gets to be attached on the flip side, I think is a civic data trust question, where I think this idea that you go to a civic data trust, you say, here's my use case, here's what I need to do to achieve that use case, here's my responsible data use assessment, and the civic data trust says, yes, go ahead. I think the added benefit of a physical connection, as I said, is that you can have physical authentication, that device is allowed to connect also.
Right, and revocation. We're talking on the break, about the idea that you should be able to, this probably has a relay in it, which if for any reason somebody contravenes their agreement with the digital trust, that could be sort of immediately turned off, or the data connection could be turned off. There's a switch in there that kind of again turns that off. So to the extent that people use that, there's a possible, not necessary, but there's a possible enforcement mechanism for the data trust.
Anyone else at all? I don't see anything burning here.
Just one quick question.
Sure,
It just
go
hit me. Sorry, I didn't have a chance to put it in here, but the Koala's a mount, like a USB. That's obviously going to have power and going to have data traffic. Is it going to also, are you sort of envisaging that it could also go into subterranean, into all the sensors that we're thinking about for water and for everything else, that there's a connectivity of the Koala into a broader network?
We haven't been thinking about that as much. We've been thinking about this as something that's up a little bit high in the in the public realm, but it might be that we need to put some more thought into how you connect sensors that are subterranean, for example. And maybe it's still it's possible it actually is the same kind of format because there's an economy of scale there. It might be solving a slightly different problem, but the fact that if it's standardized would actually mean that you could again drive down the cost of sensors. In this case, it would be like a water leak sensor or similar. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a follow-up or extension of Pamela's question and your response. Basically, what it's come up the numbers of times that the civic digital trust will be an adjudicating body for all kinds of tricky questions, and I have two concerns. One is that a trust model is not adequate for dealing with all the different kinds of things. The trust could work for certain kinds of assets, but not others. The other thing is that there are already a number of complex I prefer to call them stewardship and regulatory bodies and agencies that are in play here. And so to call it this trust alone ignores those. So we may need another terminology. And I guess the third concern I have is that putting a lot of these thorny questions into the trust or whatever it is implies that we need to figure that out and be confident that that kind of governance or regulatory mechanism is going to work well before we can go ahead with this, because if we don't, then we don't know what's going to happen. So that's about a question of timing and priorities and so it's a sort of co-development project, and it's ongoing, but I think we need to be careful that we can't agree to these sorts of things until we know that the trust is or that mechanism.
I know Prem's about to jump in, but I just echo your ongoing and co-development piece, because I don't think it's going to be, just like that. Suddenly it'll exist and it will be perfect, and it will be sort of arrive fully formed out of somebody's head. I think it probably needs to be iteration, and it might even be a little messy. Because in fact, a lot of the decisions that Data Trust will have to make will get fleshed out over time by looking at different use cases and different circumstances. They'll develop their own set of precedents and so on. So it will be iterative.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of the MIDP process, which we haven't come up today, then that needs to be, I would say, in place before we can get an approval for an MIDP.
I mean, that's a separate question that I think we should. That's a separate question completely. I think the part that you asked about the MIDP itself, though, that I will point out is I think one of the things that we have been doing is we have been taking a lot of the public consultation feedback, a lot of the feedback from the different panels and the different experts we work closely with, as well as feedback from the different regulatory bodies that you mentioned earlier, and are going to have kind of a proposal around, what the Civic Data Trust could potentially be, and much more detailed. And I think that's something that we could also bring back to this DSAP at some point and present. At least I can present the work that her team has done in this space. On the co-development point, also, just to be clear, I think that is something that this group could also take on to help do.
And Prem, one more thing. You also wanted to underscore again, because we haven't mentioned it, existing laws, whether it's MFIPPA or PIPEDA, will always underlie this. The trust is not going to have to adhere to that as part of our proposal, and so I don't want there to be any presumption that it's not going to be that. We still, as a part of the proposal, as Prem was saying, that we're thinking about, that we would could certainly bring back to this body, is what is that interplay? What does that actually mean when it comes to ultimate accountability and even enforceability? And I think those are valid questions to work through, for which we're thinking about.
Okay. Unless I see anything else, I think we'll leave it at that.
I was just wondering, when do we discuss the other data layer questions that we had, the more general ones that are both on Slido and that are not specific to Koala, or the particular presentations that we had time for today?
If there are questions that you'd like to raise, by all means, so I keep trying to. I've been inviting questions, but
okay. So yeah, this is not relevant to. It's a much more general question, but it relates to the Civic Data Trust. So one of the questions that I have is mechanisms whereby we can provide transparent access and publicly auditable trail to the decisions that are made based upon the data that's collected, and then some mechanism also to make that accessible to the individuals that will be impacted by those decisions.
So you're saying once maybe some data collection is actually in operation and it actually influences the outcomes, having some auditability of like that process.
Right. So what decisions are based on the data that's collected? Some mechanism whereby we can examine, publicly audit what is the data, and also a mechanism to make that accessible to the people and the organizations, etc., that are going to be influenced or that will feel the impact of those decisions.
I mean, I don't have a comprehensive kind of perfectly formed answer. A few observations, and in one extreme case, the data, in fact, we think this will be pretty common. The data collected will be made publicly available. It will be open data. At that point, it might be that you don't even know who's using the data. If it's available for general use, although Elisa's, well, anyway, there are going to be terms. I feel like it's only a matter of a few seconds before Lisa's going to jump in, so that's sort of an interesting challenge. I think there might be other cases where the data is not public and maybe even has some privacy implications, so it can't be made public, and therefore the auditing will have to be done by the digital or data trust in kind of a privacy preserving way, and they're going to have to be competent and trusted to go and do that auditing. And to your point, understand better how that data is contributing to actual decisions, and then make a report back in a way that's comprehensive.
Yeah,
that sounds like a lot of work.
And to your point on that report, I actually think this is fascinating, right? Because what you're suggesting is essentially right now a lot of decisions almost feel like they come down without really understanding the data that went into that decision-making process from a governance perspective. And this is outside the scope of Sidewalk Labs, because these are decisions that will come from city governance in some way, shape, or form. But what's, I think, interesting about this district potentially is that, it could show you the filter down to, the specific responsible data use assessment, the sensor and the sensor or sensors in the location, a sample of the data that was collected, like an actual graph of the output, and then the decision that was made based on that data, as well as maybe along the way what the potential biases might have been going in, so on and so forth. And it gives you kind of more opportunity for that, I think, to alter that conversation. I don't know how much of that will be Sidewalk Labs answering that question.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously it's a complex question, and there are many complex decisions that are made, but especially as it relates to urban planning and as it relates to this neighborhood, quite often the individuals that are most impacted by a particular decision are not necessarily that well represented within the data. So is there an opportunity to challenge the decision, and is there an opportunity to say, wait a sec, this has been decided based upon that data, but my interests or my data is not here, or I am not appropriately represented within this data. So some transparent way to query.
So like an appeal mechanism?
And auditable.
This is one of the, whether the process, to your point on co-development, needs to get worked for sure. But one of, I think, the interesting innovations that Elisa and her team have really worked on in this space is it's not just about the responsible data use in terms of are you using personal information, it's also how does that data impact people, right? And so that second, there's an entire part, if you go back even and look at the common space responsible data use assessment that we published online from last month, what you'll see is there's an entire segment about how are the decisions going to be made, what are the implicit biases in the data that was collected that may or may not, that you think in those parts on kind of these worst case scenarios or the groups that may be most negatively affected by the decisions that are made, and you try to think about them in advance so that they're there early on and in your thought process as you go towards the decision making. So impact on individuals is actually a key consideration from the start of this data collection process, which I think is a bit of a differentiator from what's been done to date.
Right, and it's also the inherent assumptions about data-driven decisions that majority rules, and of course what happens to those small minorities when majority rules, and taking into account the implications of the unequal impact that some of the decisions will make.
And if I remember correctly, that's part of the actual. That's actually one of the questions that are called out specifically. It's like when product managers on my team or engineers on Craig's team start thinking about a project or a project area, and they start spinning up kind of this document and start putting this down. One of the questions is specifically aligned to not to think outside the majority use case.
Yeah, I always shudder when somebody says, this machine learning scheme is 95% accurate, because you wonder, wait, what is that other 5%, and maybe who are they?
Okay, that question has elicited several responses on Slido. I'll give a chance for each person to air them, and then I think we'll probably stop and move on in the agenda. First off, Pamela.
In terms of, the question about does the data trust need to be in place, I think the data governance model for sure needs to be sorted before things move forward, because that's, I think it shows Charles 100%, I think it does. But I'm just going to say this again, like, we're talking about the data trust like it's the only data governance thing in the ecosystem, and I just want to hold the space to say that what we need when the MIDIP arrives is to step back and look at the landscape of the data governance ecosystem and say, okay, what's in here, what's needed. The trust is one of the more developed new ideas, but I would argue it's insufficient, not because the trust isn't a good idea, but because this is a complex landscape that we haven't seen the big picture of yet. So I don't want anyone to walk away thinking, I think the trust is the only answer. I think it's worth lots of really good discussion, but I think we're going to need to build other things too. And where they reside and what they look like and how they get funded are all really big, hairy questions that need to be answered.
Thanks. It's a helpful intervention. Kevin, do you just want to?
Well, I think it's actually building on what Pamela just said. Is I find that our conversation does this is, we go away and talk about things in generalities when every time you present, a new element of what you're proposing for the MIDP, and we kind of get lost in generalities, and then we bring it back to use cases, and then we go wide. I guess I'm suggesting, going back to my university days when I was a student, it's always helpful if we're starting with a use case, and every time we learn a new element, let's revisit the use case and apply what we just learned and integrate that into the use case. So then, because every time we start talking generalities, then we get lost, because we think we can't narrow in on a scenario, and then we start we're losing sight of really what we're trying to do. So if we could revisit any one of those four. And then, so the example today, so let's go back to maybe the water monitoring or whatever and say, so how would Koala and how would these networks fit into that from a tactical perspective? So then we can start looking at, well, then we need to consider this, this, and this. It would be very useful for me anyways to try and follow and trace this through every time we introduce a new concept.
No, I agree.
I like the idea of, I'm wondering whether there's like a running prototype idea that every time one of these technologies is brought in, we could say, okay, how would this apply to this prototype? Because it helps us get specific around what the questions
Absolutely.
are. Because I think kind of what Mark said was, I want us to be careful that we don't make the digital trust the panacea for all the difficult questions. Well, the data trust will take care of that. Data trust. And the reason I asked the question, whether it's picking up what Andrew and Pamela said around the sort of dependability of moving forward on the data trust, is that's not going to be an easy or fast thing to do, to operationalize, to resource, to put in place. And it isn't the only thing. We're still not determined what its scope is. Is it only Quayside? Is it bigger? Is it smaller? Is it going to exist or not? So there's a lot of questions there. And so I want to make sure that we don't sort of place all of the privacy / governance concerns into something that doesn't exist yet, and may prevent us from actually moving forward with the MIDP, or just understanding what that path is, right, so that we can move forward.
And related to that, not responding directly, but this discussion reminds me that, well, let me reiterate that we know we're not specifying the data trust. We're making some suggestions. We're opining. Take it for what you will. We have no sort of standing to specify anything. But but also as we're discussing this and talking about auditing and understanding, whether there's bias, and your point about its geographic reach eventually. It seems to me that there's a bunch of really difficult things, both policy-wise, but also from a technical point of view, detecting bias and understanding algorithms and understanding machine learning schemes that don't apply just to Quayside, that don't apply just to Toronto or Ontario or Canada. They're actually global in nature. And it would be crazy if every city, every neighborhood set up their own data trust and built this stuff from scratch. So I don't know exactly what I'm proposing, but it feels like there's some collaboration between probably a number of cities that are sort of on the leading edge of this, not just Toronto, but others, to kind of somehow pool resources, certainly from an academic point of view, which might be the easiest thing, but eventually even from a technical point of view, so that the same problems and the same audit, software, et cetera, is not doesn't have to be reinvented many times over.
I also wanted to mention that there are multiple components to the proposal. The data trust is one. I don't want people to forget that there's also the proposal that there be responsible data use guidelines that are applicable to Quayside, this district, what those guidelines are, and that there's a requirement proposed that people fill out the responsible data use assessment, which is, Prem was indicating, includes questions with respect to not only privacy by design type questions, but also by algorithmic bias and things like that to grasp at it. And those things, doesn't necessarily have to have a data trust to have that happen. We think that promotes good, responsible data use for all parties, and that's a core component too.
Well, thank you for that. I think this has been a helpful discussion to help guide when we meet next in February in terms of how we'll try to allocate out the agenda, both with some of the use case stuff and some further things we might look at, but also perhaps some time for some of the bigger picture stuff, although I don't know that.
Can I ask a question to the panel, if that's okay, around next time? Because I want to make sure that we kind of crystallize, if possible, even a rough outline of the agenda based on what I heard today. It sounds like, going back and maybe using the mobility example and talking through, the elements we spoke about today, how a potential proposed data trust and a data model would work, as well as then maybe diving deeper with that example into how we imagine open standards, open APIs helping that out also. May be an interesting kind of end-to-end run we can take next time of tying it all together. Does that sound like a good...
I would find that extremely useful myself anyways. Absolutely.
Would that be helpful for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful. The other use case, as I said, I'm very interested in is the...
we could do that one also. Maybe we'll do that.
Is the mixed use, because
and the mobility...
It just has a different public good that it's intended for, and I think that would be an interesting
we'll see if we can get that together in the time.
And by mobility case, you mean more than just figuring out whether there's a parking space available, but more broadly as to what a mobility management system might look like.
I think I mean in a specific
the parking
use
cases,
case, because I think then you get a little too general, and then we're going to lose kind of the specificity of the solution set, what things are, where they are, where those are stored, how those would work.
Also, I think for the mobility management, I think there's a bunch of context that the sort of a mobility specifically team has around potential policies and even types of layout of the streets and so on, which I'm not sure we can. Anyway,
I understand about making too much scope, but I would hope we can do something other than just the parking space thing, because
there's certainly the kind of congestion and kind of safety aspects at intersections.
We'll figure something out.
Thank you, Dave. Wanted to...
I think it's important we do nail down reduce the scope, but get into details to end and end, because I'm concerned that a number of meetings, to Kevin's point, we went to a bunch of generalizations. What is the burn rate we're going to spend before we actually just looking at everything, before we decide to prove out something?
Is that a question for us? Sorry.
It's more a statement than a question. Because I'm concerned we're burning a lot of time and money looking at generalizations before we can, to get to the end-to-end, lock it and improve one concept. Because again, it's, to Kevin's point, all general. The truth is in the details. We can't detail everything out So let's choose one, run it all the way through. Because I think just going to say the data trust will take care of it is a convenient way to keep spinning the tail.
Yeah, I do think we've now covered most of the components that go into some of these use cases, from policy to kind of use case to infrastructure and so on. So I think we actually have we've sort of talked about each of those things, so we could go through end to end at this point.
And when folks say generalizations, I just want to make sure that, last session and this session, I feel like we did dive pretty deep from a technical perspective into specific implementations, types of things we would use, so on and so forth. I think what you're saying for generalization is now, how does that work with governance approaches to it also, correct?
Well, we need to understand the whole picture because I don't think we've gotten enough detail where we'd make a purchase decision. We've heard of what was all possible. What are we going to do?
I would also stress that I don't think we as Sidewalk Labs are at the point of a purchase decision either. I think this is still kind of in that, as when you look at that product development cycle, we're still in that early stage of that, of understanding the possibilities here.
And what is our budget to go through till we decide, okay, we've done all the discovery we can. Now when do we go to the next phase? Or is it an infinite thing with the partnership? I don't know.
I'm not really sure what the question is you're asking there.
Well, it feels like it's maybe not even for us so much as the panel.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think, the proposal will come out of the MIDP. And there's a set budget for that. That's public. That's been allocated, and it's in the plan development agreement that was published last June or whatever it is. Whether all of that gets spent or not, I don't know. But there's a chunk of money and allocated to various budget categories that basically say that's what's there to produce the plan development agreement. The MIDP, and the MIDP is going to be a set of proposals for what should go forward. So I think that's the budget. I think the timeline is still evolving around that. That's my sense. I got Christina.
That's good sense. Where we're at right now.
Okay, all right. It's a useful discussion, but we're now perilously late in terms of making sure we get through the other agenda stuff. So thank you both for
Sorry,
response.
but just to make sure that we give Sidewalk Labs enough input for the next one. So are we agreeing on what they proposed in terms of what they bring to the next meeting? In terms of digging workflow around a use case, applying all of the technologies that they presented up till now?
2 use cases.
Okay, I just want to make sure before we leave this topic.
I keep hearing, I think some panelists want different things, actually. I think some want to go deep on a particular use case and some want some of that broader discussion. So what I'd suggest actually is I'm happy together with Charles to circle with Sidewalk to try to come up with a plan, and we can posit it out to the panel as a whole to make sure it meets people's needs.
Just as a heads up, because of the kind of 1 week in advance that we need to post all this stuff, to make sure that we have enough time to get that done, it would be great if we can kind of lock that down on Tuesday of next week, if that's possible.
We'll try to make sure that's an accelerated discussion to meet the timelines. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
I think it's picking the right example.
So at our last meeting, we had a discussion with Meg Davis with regards to the process of where we are in the evaluation framework for the MIDP. What we didn't quite get to was where we were at that point in time with regard to the digital elements and sort of some context of why they may seem more like a compliance check and balance. And I think it's important for the panel to understand how that's situated. The key item coming out of this particular agenda item is we had agreed at the last session to defer it to a working group, or a subcommittee, but it was unclear to me which group was going to take the mantle of that to work with me on these particular pieces. So I'm hoping that can be determined so that way we can begin to loop in on the conversation. The material is advancing in this area, so what you see is actually what was released in the public session, but we've been doing additional work behind the scenes with KPMG on the evaluation framework. It's just in a very draft format in terms of the next iteration, and that would be what I would be proposing to bring to the working group for further consideration. But just for context, the implementation requirements are the must-haves. We consider the digital governance pieces must-haves for the MIDP, and compliance with these essentially is one of those pieces of evidence that must be in place across all of the solutions. So when we are talking about the data privacy and digital governance components, they build a lot on the principles that were in the PDA that had been Waterfront Toronto's basic starting position with regards to Sidewalk Labs of what we needed to start to see when they were bringing forward ideas. Keeping in mind that in the RFP, we actually weren't asking for a smart city partner, and therefore we're not overly prescriptive about what constituted sort of a pass or fail or a high score or low score on smart cities, because that wasn't the focus of the RFP. So we are working through this model with George and Chantel and with KPMG. And there is broadly a pass-fail, check-balance sort of binary approach to a lot of these things. And then we're starting to work through, and this is where the working group, I'm hoping, can inform the discussion with regards to the sort of grayer areas with regards to ethics and so on. We have some principles-based statements, but we need to get more granular about what would constitute compliance in those areas. So I won't go through and read all of these. Hopefully you've had a chance to go through them. These have been updated in reflection of the conversations that we've been hearing at the roundtables as well as the materials that have been coming in through the civic labs and the subsequent emails that have been coming in that space. So they have been moving and shifting and updating, but that's why they are still at that sort of higher order of evaluation criteria, is because of what the point of the Quayside project initially was. So if there are some general comments, I think I'm open to conversation and questions on that. But as I said, my main position on that is I really do need to have a working session with a subset of the DSAB on these matters.
Teresa.
So one question that I have been struggling with for a long time now, trying to get my head around, is, and this slide raises it for me in a couple of places, is whether, because the slide talks about compliance with all applicable laws, and where's the other one? Full compliance with all laws pertaining to privacy that apply to Quayside. And, you know, a big question for me, and I'm struggling to understand, is whether the data that is being collected in the Quayside project is public sector data or private sector data. Because the all applicable laws really, to a large extent, turns on whether it's public sector or private sector data. And what the obligations are and what can happen with that data, I think, also turns on whether it's public sector or private sector. And in fact, if it is public sector data, then it has huge implications for even being able to talk about a civic data trust. Because to the extent that there's personal information, I don't think the city can, the language of the civic data trust is that it's going to be donated to the city can't donate personal data under MFIPA to anyone. So for me, these are like really fundamental questions, and I don't see the answers coming out anywhere, and perhaps it's something that still hasn't been resolved, but these are big questions.
Those are the very big questions, and why it's taking a bit longer is we needed to understand, I think, collectively what data might get collected, and then go through an analysis of that data and a classification, and what would be public versus private, what role the city, Waterfront Toronto, some of the other actors in the area, the space may play versus private developers, or with private developers. So that's one of those areas that until we had enough information, we couldn't go very deep yet. And I completely agree with you, because depending on what type of data it is and who owns the data, the regime that governs that data is completely different. So we need to think that through, and I think we're starting to get to that point now that we have the beginnings of enough of an information to do a data. I'm looking over at Elise and saying data classification exercise. It's been on the to-do list for a while, but that will help us get to that answer. And I think also having deeper engagement with all three levels of government on this will also be very important to understand. Is the city looking at owning the public realm data? Would the sensors be owned by the city? That type of decision needs to be understood as well. One thing that is becoming increasingly clear is that Waterfront Toronto is not going to own the data, right? We never presumed that we would, but that's not the business that we're in. So finding out which parties we need to have this conversation, we see ourselves still in this convener type of role on that conversation. So,
but it seems to me then, because a lot of talk and a lot of energy has gone into the Civic Data Trust, but if this is public sector data, then it may be that an entirely different governance model is both appropriate and legally required, in which case that's a lot of work that's gone into talking and thinking about a civic data trust when that may not be an appropriate model. So,
and I think the reality is that when it comes to who's going to own the data and what data it is, it's going to be an and, it's not an or. Yes. There's going to be a whole spectrum of data and data ownership depending on where in the project that data is collected,
right,
and who's actually engaged. So that's why I think getting very granular and figuring out, whether it be the public realm data or the in-building data, whether it's utility data or it's data that the citizens have actually freely offered into for some sort of an app that maybe they're considering. These are all very different scenarios that haven't been fully fleshed out. But I think we're starting to actually get to the point of knowing enough now to have that conversation. Which gets back to the notion of that sort of elongated timeline and why it's so important that it actually shift a little bit so we can have those conversations.
I have Mark, Pamela, and Kevin.
Yeah, so my working hypothesis, Teresa, is it's going to be both public sector data and private sector data. And whatever data governance models, I see Lisa nodding over there. So whatever data governance models we come up with have to cover both cases. So I that's my working hypothesis, has been all along. And I think the digital trust could still potentially play a role in facilitating access to data, even if it's stored and owned and controlled by a public sector body. So we have to work that through. The question I was going to actually, that's my thoughts, but the question I was going to actually ask Christina at kind of the higher level, because I didn't want to get any specific comments, is there's a number of areas in the priority outcomes, in fact probably quite a few, that touch on digital, and I'll just mention a couple here related to job creation and economic development. So serve as a test bed enabling Canadian firms to overcome barriers to achieve scale, bolster the local technology ecosystem. I mean, those are extremely digital, so I wouldn't want to limit our conversation to kind of the implementation requirements.
No, and there is an economic development piece. So there's a second set of slides too with regards to more the going to scale. I don't know why this isn't moving forward, but there is a second slide that deals with data and going to scale and companies and growing the ecosystem and that kind of piece. And there's an economic development set of criteria as well that aren't all fully digitally centric, but they are adjacent to these that, as we work through this with the working group, I can bring those forward as well. That deals with number of jobs, sort of catalytic kind of cause of the project and so on.
Yeah. So I mean, I'd like us to take a broader view of how digital impacts the other pillars of success, and not just, the narrow digital governance questions.
Right.
And if that's okay with you, I think that would be a good mandate for us to be looking at.
There's an extensive body of work on the evaluation criteria that has not actually been finalized yet, that I think would be worth actually going through the process and so on, but it is a lengthy piece of work, and I'm not the only person that needs to be a part of that conversation. So I would suggest that at the first subcommittee or working group meeting, we walk through sort of where we're at across the board, so you understand too where there's points of intersection with the other pillars, if you will, from the MIDP, to make sure that everything's being covered off as thoroughly as we would expect for a project like this.
Kevin, Andrew, Charles. Oh, no, sorry, Pamela.
I just wanted to comment again. I feel like I said the same thing 4 times today about the first bullet point about proposals for approaches for data governance. I think it's like in the minute there will be proposals that will come from Sidewalk, but again, the vendor suggesting the data governance framework is one voice, but there needs to be time, space, and a process held for a bigger articulation of what that looks like. I think good ideas can come from a variety of places, but I don't want that to be the proxy for the bigger conversation. Okay.
And that's never been the inference, actually. Like, even the RFP, there's been a misinterpretation of what was asked for in the RFP, because what I think unfortunately happened is that the beginning of the question had the was like, you know, section 3.1 or whatever, and then I think data governance was like on F, where it basically said to work with Waterfront Toronto to examine and recommend, and then all of these other things. Somehow it's been diluted that we were asking the vendor. That wasn't the case. We were trying to have ideas put forward that have been barriers in the past, but we certainly know and understand and respect that, Pamela, for sure.
Well, and further, you know, Infrastructure Canada is running a Smart City Challenge phase 1 of 3. You know, the things that will emerge from here are relevant to things that will emerge in the other 4 communities that win, but in the subsequent 8 that also win. And so this, you know, reviving the notion of subsidiarity from good old development days 20 years ago about, you know, devolving decision-making responsibility and authority to the level of government that makes the most amount of sense. To me, this is a tripartite governance strategy that really, it's going to take time to hammer out, but it's probably one of the most important data conversations we're going to have in this country in the next 18 months, I think. Is how do we collectively, hierarchically manage data governance in smart city projects?
And I just want to reflect too, I think all 3 levels of government are actually here again today to be a part of the session and hear the session, which is very, very strong and very positive. And that way we can continue the conversation as well through the Intergovernmental Steering Committee and the working groups that are structured with governments as well. Okay, thanks.
2 quick things. I think as we move forward, we should look at least borrowing a page from the Open Data Playbook, namely adopting an open by default policy, which will mean that, you know, inherently data will be made open and you have to make the case for which to close it. So it causes you to go through that process of understanding why wouldn't we want that out there as opposed to the other way around, because it's easy to skirt around an issue and lock it down if you take it, if you don't adopt open by default. The other thing, and maybe Christina, it's in the second part, but it's lacking here, is the whole notion of the sustainability. And so maybe it fits into the economic development part of things, because the private sector is largely, you know, sort of the users of the data are not captured in this. It's really locking down and protecting what we're collecting, but we're not thinking so much here in the evaluation criteria about how it's going to be used and by whom to drive economic development outcomes. So if that's in the second part, then
that's actually in the third part, so that's very helpful because I'll have to bring forward those. Those are actually items that are in what we call the Volume 3 evaluation criteria, which is the business case evaluation criteria.
Okay.
So what I'll make a point of is pulling as much of that forward as well without pulling everything forward, so it's unmanageable for this group to look at as well.
Thank you.
I have Andrew and then Charles.
Yeah. I have 5 points. I'll try to do them quickly. First of all, I think, you know, the criteria as they're listed here, I mean, there's lots of good points in there, but it's a very uneven and heterogeneous collection. The first one about, you know, setting a world model. It's great. I mean, that's an ambition. It's not specified in any depth. Others are quite narrow. I think we need to greatly expand this. I think this is a long way from an evaluation framework that we can actually use in practice. I think that it needs to be, as you're already doing, basing it on the consultations, but I think there needs to be a systematic review of the material that has been collected, and I've proposed, you know, in the document you've seen, that Waterfront Toronto commission an independent expert study of all of those public engagement materials, of collating the responses and organizing it. This committee has a very limited capacity, or panel has a very limited capacity to do this. If we unless we meet in some other way, but as it is now, we can't develop that framework ourselves. We need a lot more input. I think there needs to be, you need to be looking at, as Pamela was mentioning, these other smart city initiatives. I've mentioned Open North as as one that has provided, done a lot of work on this. Certainly other cities around the world also. When you talk about trying to assign it to a working group, we haven't even really set them up, but I think we hopefully we can make some progress on that later in this meeting. But just given the spread of issues, I think that it's going to be multiple working committees, and we'll need to sort out what committees deal with what parts of this framework. I mean, even just to take what we've got here. And then also, I think it would be helpful to look at how the other aspects of the MIDP are being evaluated by Waterfront Toronto, because obviously there needs to be some coherence from Sidewalk Labs' point of view. I think they've got to see those relations, and it would be helpful for us to see how you're thinking about it. But because the digital layer or the digital aspects are not in isolation. Mark was mentioning a number of these other areas like environmental efficiency and so on, where these intersect. Of course, they have to intersect. So it's an incredibly, I'd say, complicated thing. It's a very demanding task. It's going to take us months and months. I mean, I think even to get to the point in which we are confident that we have a basis for evaluating that proposal, the plan.
I just wanted to respond to a few things. And so I agree, this list, which was just for the public consultation session we had for the roundtable, as I said, it's advanced quite a bit with the work that we've been doing with KPMG. So just to put your mind at rest, it's a little bit more consistent and less heterogeneous in its nature by the time that we actually dig into the draft versions that we're looking at. The notion of looking at other projects, that was actually where we started with this whole process, and did an extensive study with Arup back before we even issued the RFP to look at sort of the eco districts and smart city work around the world. We've commissioned an additional piece of work with them with regards to sort of standards and governance models across a number of different areas within what we're seeing back for the MIDP as well. So that is useful information to us just to make sure we have the latest information, because that was done 3 years ago. With regards to the complexity of the framework and sort of how we're approaching it, it is an extraordinarily robust framework, as was the original framework when we evaluated the RFPs. That KPMG and the group that has been involved extensively with IO and very large projects as well have helped us put that together. So part of, I think what's important is that these are internal draft documents within Waterfront Toronto. So being able to have some closed session working sessions with this group would be enormously helpful, so we can get things right before putting them out and them being subject to misinterpretation or misinformation in the public realm and the public sphere. So saying that, hopefully we can get to that point where we can have a working session with this group, so we can table a much broader swath of information that is in progress, rather than having to, and we talked about this last time, having it refined to such a point before it can be released. It's a messy enough space as it is, and I don't think we want to add any more of the mess to the whole landscape. So, but I think there's some very valuable input this group could bring at the moment that we're at right now in that process as well.
Well, certainly we need much more than PowerPoint slides. I mean, those background documents, and taking Kevin's point about open by default, I think...
which is interesting. It used to be on an earlier version of these slides too.
Well, it should be there, but also just open process by default, and that Waterfront Toronto's internal documents, I think that they need to be able to put them out in provisional form. I mean, obviously, it then opens up other questions, but I don't think we can wait until the internal processes have been completed before we
I mean, to be very clear, we have work that we have to do as staff at Waterfront Toronto to get things to a point that we would be comfortable in sharing, and then we would like to be able to share those earlier with an extended group of subject matter experts, so that we can accelerate some of that work and advance that work. But we do have work that we need to do that we would do as a normal course of duty as staff of the organization before it would become shareable with anyone outside of the organization. But we're considering this committee hopefully as a bit of an extension of that internal, and that's why we asked for your help on these. So I think there's a moment in time where that could get more fulsomely released, but we were hoping for some assistance prior to that moment as well.
Sure.
Just in the spirit of us being a digital strategy advisory panel, and this may be in your part too, but I noticed most of the measures here are around privacy and digital governance, which is why it's called that, which are very important. And it's not that what I'm going to say shouldn't take away from that. But I think in terms of us thinking about it, supposedly thinking through what does an urban area look like built from the internet up, there's missing some elements there. And that is, number one, the design implication of having a much more tech-forward city. So what is the experience of that space, the residents' experience, and secondly, what's the environmental impact of having some of these technologies embedded into everything that we're doing? And then thirdly is the sort of civic engagement side of it. So it's like, what are, in terms of that kind of community, what is the residents' not only experience of the community, what is their role in terms of contributing and co-producing and co-designing, because they now have tools, and we now have the civic tech movement. We actually have residents who are able to make their own technologies. And how are they contributing? So when we're like evaluating this plan, we should be thinking about what are those types of things. Those are still digital concerns, and I don't see that here.
I'm smiling at my colleagues because these are all active conversations. I think we've had parts of those conversations even this morning because there's active files that are advancing on those areas. So very, very good comments, and we'll hopefully be able to bring some of that back, both through the evaluation, but also through some of the other things that Sidewalk would be bringing forward through the MIDP that maybe we can get a sneak peek on as well.
Okay.
So, Pamela.
Yeah, I'll just add to Charles's point that at our last meeting, this question was left lingering about, well, you don't think you have to read the whole 800-page thing. Well, as a planner, I think I do, because, Sidewalk's whole proposition is when technology meets urbanism and lands in a real place, technology is different, right? And so not everybody will necessarily do it, but there will be some of us who will read it for where it lands, because that's how the technology impacts people. And so I know that it's really important not to work beyond the scope, but scope means different things to different people based on the expertise around the table. So,
and I think that's an extraordinarily important piece that we're still working through with Sidewalk as well, whether there's, aside from the multi-volume kind of big proposal that you just spoke to, if there's a subset or summary document that could be produced, as well as perhaps some compendium kind of pieces around technology that could be brought forward for those members of the panel that may not have as much time or resources to be able to actually contribute, so that there's an optionality to the type of information that's being presented and what that may look like. But we are still working through that with Sidewalk, and as part of that update around the timeline, hopefully we'll land on something a bit better. At the current version of what we are starting to see and percolate through, there's technology embedded everywhere. So it would be very hard for you to view it just in a one chapter abstract kind of piece. So we have taken that back, and that's all part of the conversations we're currently having with them. And as well as, depending on what the answer to that is, it has an impact on the timeline. But what I would say to the panel is the material that you have seen over the course of the past 3 sessions are very significant pieces and views into what Sidewalk has been thinking on these areas. So I would say that you're not starting from mid-up review day 0 when the mid-up actually would arrive in even draft format. You have a very significant glimpse into all of the conversations that have been had in this file. So even the conversation and comments and questions that you're asking now will help you in evaluating the MIDP when it comes forward. So I think it's an iterative process that starts 2 meetings ago.
But that's a good discussion. What do you want or need from us?
I just
now?
need some direction. As I said, I would like to have a working session with the group, and it should be before the next meeting. So to know if that's a more fulsome cut of this group because of the breadth of the things that are proposed in the MIDP, or if there is a subset of this group that would like to actually be engaged in that. It doesn't even have to be one of the standing working committees, but who can I actually convene a meeting that would be a working meeting that wouldn't constitute a full panel session.
You want volunteers?
Volunteers would be great. Elena, Teresa, Pamela, Yida, Charles, Mark. Anyone? Okay, great. Can we just make sure? Did you get all that, Nathan?
Nope.
No, okay.
One more time.
So Elena,
Everybody.
Teresa, Pamela, Yida, Charles, and Mark.
And
And Andrew.
Yeah.
And you were holding up the other hand. You couldn't.
Yes.
We're stealthy.
And like,
Great. Well, thanks for everyone.
Thanks.
For stepping up. Subcommittee structure process. Is that what we just did, or is there something more you want?
Just in terms of, I think we could just take that offline.
Okay. All right. In that case, I guess I need a motion to go into closed session. As you know, in the agenda. We've got-
So moved.
sorry, just about the. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Before, I thought we were going to discuss the working groups.
Okay.
I don't know that any discussion is needed right now. I think we just created a working group.
Oh, I thought we were going to create a number. We have a proposal for 4 different working groups, and I thought that was
The subcommittees?
yeah, the subcommittees. There were on your slide. I think you had a slide in the packet. And let me just.
No, you're absolutely right. It wasn't on the
item
agenda. The
6.
question
Yeah.
is that time well spent right now, given that there's no particular burning need for those subcommittees?
I thought.
There's 2 subcommittees I think that have immediate actions before them. This new sort of ad hoc committee around the evaluation, and then the second one would be around governance with regards to the panelist applications that are going to be coming in. So those are the 2 most pressing actionable ones. And then the group that's working on the civic labs will be kept abreast of the things that are coming up with regards to the civic labs, with regards to community engagement. But I'm not sure if there's anything specifically actionable around any of the other working groups at this moment, or if we need to come up with terms of reference. Is that more what you were thinking as governance within those working groups?
Yes. It looks like it's moved on. I thought that the areas of the working groups that we had proposed, the 4 areas, I mean, it wasn't fully formed yet, but that those would be a place where the questions of evaluation and sort of deeper discussions in particular areas that we can't get to in this meeting and in the panel meetings, that's where that would take place. That was how I understood the proposal and the way in which we had signed up for them and the way that you had organized them. And I thought that was a sensible process. I can see that there needs to be some coordination between them if they're going to contribute to the evaluation criteria and the process. But it sounds like you've basically superseded that structure with this ad hoc committee that you've just formed, and so I guess I'm a little puzzled by that, because I thought the idea was to separate out the areas according to sort of topic and expertise.
Christina may have a different view or something to add. I think we've struggled a little bit in terms of support for the panel generally, and we're hiring, of course, to try to fix some of that. My hope would be, as we get into the discussions once we go into the closed session, we'll get a better sense of how that's going to sort itself out. Once that does, I think we'll be in a far better position to have those committees function in the way that we initially did. But there's an urgency with respect to the evaluation of the MIDP, which is why, or the criteria, which is why we just established what we established. At least that was how I saw it.
Yeah. Yes. The timetable on that is for the getting ready for the MIDP is a critical one. And, so I hope that there's enough time that we can take advantage of the original idea of a more extended deliberation through these expertise, or not expertise based, but sort of topically based working groups. So I'm afraid that what we're proposing is going to be too ambitious in terms of the ability for us to be able to deal with that as a committee of the whole. And particularly, as you just said, that if you're struggling with resources to support the panel, then I think those resources need to be in place, and that the schedule needs to be adapt to meet the capacity rather than to force through a schedule for which we don't have the capacity.
I think back to your point, it would be interesting to go into closed session to figure out the hiring and the support and to drive this on timeline, do the imminent things that we need to do, imminently form councils or committees, subcommittees to tackle those and be very, very clear then on what the other committees do and when, because I know I haven't signed up for a committee, but I'd be happy to have that discussion again, because it was a little ambiguous for me as to how we were going to execute that, but I think it really has to be about, who's going to support it, what's the timeline, and then do we actually have the capacity for that?
Yeah. It sounds like there's a lot of sort of unanswered questions around the subcommittee, so might I propose, and given the time that we have, that we take that discussion offline, that maybe the chair and the co-chair or the vice chair and Christina come back to the committee with a proposal about how those might work, including their cadence and what their role is, and then have the rest of the panelists sort of comment, and then we can, in the next meeting, finalize that. But it sounds like this working group for the evaluation framework is the more urgent need, and so we'll convene that.
Agreed, and it stems out of the last meeting, but there was just a lack of clarity in the last meeting. So this would be not to supersede those committees; it's to actually just accomplish a specific piece of work that is well defined.
More task force, less committee.
That's exactly yes.
So
it's an evaluation task force.
Because I agree. I don't think we want to lose the notion of the subcommittees, because I think it does give us an opportunity to do a deeper dive on pieces of work. But I think where we're not sure is how, given the limited time that the panelists already have available, is how we would operationalize that. So I think that's and I don't know whether we want to spend the next 20 minutes doing that.
I don't think we could do it in 20 minutes.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't think we can.
So I think your suggestion is a good one. I think, in fact, this working session might create some work for the committees.
Yeah.
I think you might, to your point, Andrew, that certain topics might need to be more deeply fleshed out. And I think that might help as well.
And it would also be good to understand what's the actual urgency of developing the evaluation criteria.
Just with such a sizable commitment to this first committee, if we have a second requirement in terms of governance, and I'm happy to actually volunteer for that. Great. Step up with the first one. It's a lot of reps.
I think Charles' suggestion, people are good with that. Great. Okay. So in that case, let's once again I'll go for the motion to move to closed session, which will hopefully give us the information we need to move forward. Mark that. All in favor? Great.
Okay. So now that we're going into closed session, the participants from government can stay, or Toronto staff can stay, but the public will need to recuse themselves from the room.
Can we just remind everyone that we're moving into a closed session because we're discussing an HR matter?
Yes.
And that's the only reason why?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Double checking.
We don't have any resolutions. Is there any other business? Hearing none, can I get a motion to adjourn? And Andrew? We're done.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.